Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
The town cemetery was unusually crowded today. Everyone who knew the late businessman Alan Campbell had come. Employees of his company, numerous relatives and colleagues, who always painfully perceived the loss of one of the representatives of their closed business club. I wonder if Campbell had time to leave a will. After all, 2 sons, one a drug addict, stopped his last choice. A muffled whisper drifted through the crowd of mourners, passing from one to another. It fizzled and grew into rumors that had nothing to do with reality. The sons of the deceased stood a little apart from the main mass, as if afraid to disappear into the crowd, eager to say goodbye to their father. Jason, the older brother, watched the funeral procession with a squeamish grin that no one but he could interpret. He was a fairly tall guy whose appearance was spoiled by a slouch, a bulging forehead, and close-set eyes and an elongated face. About such people say, a little better than a monkey. Thank you for that. Of course, Jason thought of himself as the first fiddle in the family. He was sure that his father had left him his business, not his brother, who had only pubs and women. And as we know, those things don't lead to good things. Jason thought to himself, holding a bouquet of roses with an even number of flowers. At that moment, he unwittingly stubbed his toe on a thorn. He bit his lip, suppressing the pain on his finger, and a drop of blood came out, which he wiped sloppily with his jacket. Why, you can't see it on black anyway. His younger brother Brian, standing next to him, looked sickly and pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his lips were dry. Those who knew him better could guess that it was because of last night's drinking, which had lasted into the morning. Brian had never been a good drinker, and he was always getting into trouble for it. Even though Jason was only a year and a half older than he was, the difference between them seemed like a bottomless chasm with no way to bridge it. The brothers didn't get along, practically couldn't stand each other. Jason was always supportive of the reckless Brian, ready to go on a wild spree at any moment. While suffering from a hangover, Brian mentally watered the funeral procession, proceeding orderly and noble. Alan Campbell's life had ended suddenly. The pain in his chest had made itself known before, and lately it had become intolerable. It was rumored that Alan was found to have a severe heart disease, which was diagnosed only at such an advanced age. And the entourage of the businessman immediately began to talk about the inevitability of transplantation of donor organs, to find which have already been allocated impressive funds and manpower. Unlike their mother, Campbell's sons to their father's illness calmly. You just take care of yourself. I'll look after the business, and people know me. In general, we will not lose, said Jason. William Jackson's face showed that he had expected a very different answer. Brian went even further in his thinking, suggesting to his father that he hand over the reins to the manager. What's wrong with that, Pa? We'll have a special man to look after our money, and we'll look after him. What's the use of hovering in a stuffy office day after day? William grinned, then involuntarily pressed his hand to the left side of his chest. No, son, that's not how business is done. Business needs to be held tightly in our hands so no one can go against us. But at the same time, you need to be flexible in communication with your subordinates so that you don't bend the stick. Otherwise, they'll break down and go to the competitors to please them. If you and your brother were crossed, it would work. He's too cruel, too despotic. And you're a good man, you can mold yourself into whatever you want. You put up with everything. Don't you? Brian lowered his eyes in agreement, thinking only of the coming party with his friends at the nightclub. He didn't realize that the timeline of his father's life had already begun its countdown. Alan died in the hospital without waiting for a heart donor. The businessman was to be buried only in a closed coffin, as he had ordered it a week before he left. I don't want my competitors to look at me and rejoice. I'm like a bone in their throat. I've been them for so many years. Frank Parker's just waiting for me to go down. I've done him a lot of harm in my time by stealing his fiancée and beating him in business. He can't forgive all his life, so no postmortem photos for the newspaper or any other nonsense. They came up to him and touched him roughly. Good riddance. Listening to their father's order, the brothers did not believe that they would have to fulfill his request. At least in the next 10 to 15 years, certainly did not believe it, and the employees of his company. Now Alan Campbell will involve all his connections, attract whoever is necessary, and the donor organ will be found. Is this kind of power a joke? All the money in one hand? Guys like him don't die. Well, they do, of course, but not at an age when the capital itself floats into the hands of competitors and only crumbs from his pie remain. As the huge lacquered coffin was carried, the atmosphere in the place of burial heated up to the limit. In fact, all the people present at the funeral divided into 3 factions. Close to the family Campbell, a competitor of the late businessman Frank Parker and his entourage, and ordinary citizens attracted by such a funeral pompous event. Frank's squinting brother. He must have been our saint's father, Judas Jason whispered. Why did my father get sick? If you remember, the donor center was a mess too. They promised me a heart a week ago. It's no use. Jason clutched the bouquet of roses. and the sharp thorns screwed back into his fingers. The donor center was a mess. How did Parker get the money to whoever needed it? That's with a time change or a screw-up. This is bullshit. Are you out of line? It's like some kind of spy passion, Brian said uncertainly, and looked at the pedestal where the massive lacquered coffin with his father's body was placed. Everything was going according to the highest standards. But how could it be otherwise when such a prominent businessman and philanthropist was passing away? The first to say goodbye to his father were the members of the Campbell family. Then, according to the predetermined order, should have gone colleagues, friends, and then all others, including business rivals in the person of notorious Frank Parker. But as soon as the wife of the deceased together with his sons moved away from the coffin, as he immediately was quite a strange young man. Who the hell is that? A relative. Who allowed him to approach out of turn? An unpleasant whisper ran through the crowd. The guy looked a little more than 20 years old, shabby clothes, worn-out jeans, shoes that had not been cleaned or repaired for a long time. He's a vagrant, but who let him in here? Who is he? Jason exclaimed in amazement. Irina wrinkled her nose and put her hand to her temple. She didn't know this guy, and she didn't care about that right now. After all, they were burying her husband, she had to understand. Well, some guy came to the funeral, wanted to say goodbye. What's the point of making a big deal out of it? But Jason didn't want to hear about it. He jumped up to the tramp and shoved him roughly in the shoulder. What are you doing here? Get your filthy hands off my father's coffin and get out of here. Or do you want money? Well, of course you all want money, don't you? Here you go, I don't care. You can pour for the repose of my father's soul. A whirlwind of small bills settled on the smooth surface of the coffin, flashed in front of the tramp's face. He looked at Jason, who was blushing with anger. What are you looking at? Take it and get out of here. Or is that not enough for you? The people at the funeral grumbled indignantly. Most of them had come to say goodbye to the deceased, not to listen to an argument between the eldest son and a beggar. Brian tried to calm his brother down, but he went off the chain, calling the innocent boy the most profane words. Then, calming down a little, he looked at his father's rival and pointed his finger at him. Listen, aren't you the one who sent him here by chance? Why? To make fun of him for the last time and to make you feel good about yourself. William Jackson turned pale, then unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. How dare you say that to me, you little brat? Does your father's crown bother you? I'll fix it for you right now. And so the conflict with the strange tramp became more than just a quarrel. In fact, the two families, Campbell and Parker, were ready to clash like a pack of yard dogs. The elderly cemetery caretaker had seen a lot of things over the years, but what would this be? This was a real shock. Fortunately, it didn't come to hands, and the passions that had flared up so suddenly gradually subsided, leaving in the hearts of the invitees unpleasant bitterness and regret. The funeral ceremony went on as usual. People visibly calmed down and penetrated the grief caused by the burial of the late businessman. No one even remembered about the guy who was not afraid to come to the coffin to say goodbye to Alan Campbell before everyone else. It wasn't until the coffin was at the bottom of the grave that everyone breathed a sigh of relief and took turns throwing vodka and earth on the lid. Jason had already pulled himself together and, trying not to look in the direction of his competitors, paid his respects to his father. Brian was among the first to leave the cemetery, as he was in a hurry to get something strong to drink at the nearest cafe. In about an hour, the cemetery was practically empty. And only one man stood in front of the grave of the deceased businessman and was sad. This young vagrant's name was Artem, and his life was full of twists and turns that others had never even heard of. Sleep well, William Jackson. May you rest in peace, Artem whispered and headed toward the cemetery gate. At the same time, a luxury foreign car was flying along the highway with an arrow. Frank Parker was comfortably seated in the back seat. At his right hand sat the manager of his company, Gregory, who owed him everything. But has it been figured out who gets Campbell's company? Is it that upstart Jason? The businessman was the first to start. The manager coughed embarrassedly, but answered the question. I tried to get a hold of the notary who drew up the will, but all to no avail. He flatly refused to disclose the terms. No money helped. I knew it wouldn't work. Although I'm 99% sure that the eldest will get everything. That's the way it's always done in business circles. To some extent, it's a law. One for all, Frank Parker replied. He hated the Campbell family with all his heart, with the exception of one person, the deceased's wife, whom he had known since his youth. They had all been acquainted. Then, he and Emily Allen. There was no business in sight, and so they simply enjoyed their youth and carefree life. As students of economics, Frank and Allen were always competing, wanting to appear before Emily in a favorable light. It is worth one to give a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums, as the second is already carrying an armful of grandiose roses. And so it was with everything. You don't give any freedom at all. You looked for suitors, surrounded me with care. That because of you now afraid to approach me, jokingly smiling, Emily said. At such moments, everyone either laughs or falls into despair, feeling proud that they can protect their girlfriend from those who do not deserve her attention. Each of them wanted to be the leader, and only Emily could tame their competitive spirit, though for a while striving to please the object of their desire. Frank and Allen forgot only one thing, that the cause of the conflict lies not in Emily's suitors, but in themselves, not wanting to find out the relationship first of all with each other. At some point, Alan had to go with a student mountaineering group in the mountains. What immediately took advantage of Frank, surrounding Emily with double care and warmth. In fact, there was nothing wrong with that. In the world, someone always wins or loses. That's life. Yes, only Alan considered it a betrayal. How could you? And behind my back. Isn't that despicable? Frank visibly tensed. But he didn't lose his footing and replied just as defiantly, "Look, Emily made her own choices. Therefore, you don't get to decide for her. Understand?" That night, it was a miracle that it didn't end in a fight. Since then, Alan and Frank have cut off all communication. Alan's friends and acquaintances were waiting for him to retaliate. But the guy delayed and deliberately saved his strength. 6 months later, Frank was arrested on the street during a personal search by officers of the Patrol Post Service. In his pocket, the guy was found a prohibited substance, the possession of which provided for a solid term of imprisonment. Many were convinced that it was Alan who planted it. Who else but him? You couldn't find a better candidate. Alan, however, denied as much as he could, and even wanted to hire a good lawyer for his former friend. But Frank considered it an ordinary trick, and, flatly refusing to defend himself, received 5 years in prison. But Alan came out the winner from this situation, because after 6 months married Emily and finally trampled the male friendship. It was said that such haste was caused by the pregnancy of the bride. Now in Frank's eyes it looked like a real betrayal. Much water had passed since then, but the feud between Alan and Frank had not subsided for a moment, and now it was at an end. Frank didn't think so. He realized that now he would have to fight his dead friend's son. "Well, we'll fight. I'd just like to know the name of the new rival," what the deceased had thought up in his will. Pressing his lips, the businessman said for some reason. The manager nodded understandingly, but did not pursue the subject, knowing that it would be more expensive for himself. Back home from the funeral, Jason says to his wife, Emily, like a long-established habit, they separated around the house, where each had their favorite spot. Emily thought, "How unfair can life be after all?" Jason wondered what the notary would say tomorrow. "No, my dad's definitely going to sign it over to me." "No, who else? There's no hope for Brian at all. It's pretty obvious." "But only I know. All right, I'm going to nail that Frank guy. They're not going to go easy on him. He ain't going to get that from me. No way." Jason would be surprised to know that the late Alan's rival was thinking the same thing. Everyone sensed that the familiar business environment was undergoing a bizarre metamorphosis. The balance of power was changing with it. Some would get a chance to rise to the top, and some would be thrown off their pedestal. To each his own, as they say. The next morning, the Campbell family, Emily, Jason, and Brian, gathered at the notary office on Peace Street. Some of the company's top executives were also present, as was the status. So here they were. The notary paused for a moment, then put on his glasses and read out the will of the late Alan Campbell in an embarrassed, family-like manner. The speech was full of legal terms, and to the simple Brian seemed incomprehensible and boring. But the main point he grasped at once was that the house and the surrounding buildings were to go to his wife, Emily. Jason got a car and a country cottage overlooking the river, but Brian received in possession of a second car and a plot of land for development in the elite part of the city. After the main part of the will was announced, everyone present froze. Who will get the main capital? Who would get all of the late Campbell's business? Why? There were no other orders. Jason asked, impatient. The notary adjusted his glasses on his nose and then looked around at everyone in the room. There were orders, of course, but they were for someone else, someone who had nothing to do with the Campbell family. What? What do you mean unrelated? What's that? An outsider, Jason shrieked. Brian clamped his mouth shut and glanced warily at his brother, who was already jumping up and down. But for an elderly notary, such reactions from his client seemed mundane and undeserving of his worries. At that moment, the office door opened, and a young boy timidly squeezed into the room. Jesus, what's he doing here? What had he come for? You want to get the inheritance garbage can? Jason couldn't help himself. The young businessman's astonishment had an explanation. For the very same tramp who had attended Alan Campbell's funeral had entered the notary's office. His identity was unknown to all assembled, as were the reasons for his presence at the time of the reading of the will. Sensing the tension in the room, the notary immediately added, "Don't get excited, Jason. William Jackson has a right to be here for the simple reason that your father's company belongs to him." Jason's face stretched and his lips turned into a single thin line. Brian looked from his brother to his mother in surprise. He still didn't understand what was happening. The notary noticed this and decided to explain himself. "Is this some kind of joke? Do you have to laugh?" "Yes?" The notary smiled. "No, it's not a joke, young man. It's as clear as daylight. I think your father knew what he was getting into. He wasn't himself. Why'd he sign over everything to a pauper?" Jason punched the air with his palm. "Don't insult one of the heirs in my presence. And if you're so anxious to get into a fight, do it outside my office. I've said my piece." Immediately stopped him, notary. All this time, Artem stood modestly aside and did not know what to say in response. Yesterday, a courier came to him. handing him a strange envelope. Artem opened it and could not contain his surprise. Inside was a notice that he had to report to the notary's office, which was located at 12 Park Avenue, and nothing else. And now Artem learns that he has become the owner of a huge company with multi-million-dollar assets. It's a miracle. Unlike her children, Emily did not feel negative toward Artem, because she saw that he was as surprised by the unexpected inheritance as everyone else. Jason, on the other hand, was ready to give the unfortunate man a glare. Realizing the awkwardness of the moment, Artem decided to leave the notary's office to get some fresh air. His head was spinning from the abundance of information he had received in such a short time. Unfortunately, the furious Jason had not given him any peace of mind. As he left the notary's office, he jumped up to Artem and grabbed his sleeve. "What did you do to him like that? How could you change his father's mind? This is just unbelievable. Just yesterday you were sniffing trash cans for food, and today you're in the elite Jason. Stop it. The kid's not guilty of anything." William Jackson sharply cut his son off. "You hear me, suck it up and forget it. Whatever. And it was your late father's will. Have some respect." After all, Emily tugged Jason rather sharply. He flinched and turned around in a startled manner. It had been a long time since he'd seen his mother so flustered and determined at the same time. And why is she sticking up for a backwater vagrant? Artem did not bother with the major and with a short nod walked away. Why all these squabbles? It would be better to understand what to do next, Artem thought. But go, but watch out. I won't leave it like that. "You get it out of your system," Jason shouted after him and shoved him with his foot. Information is always worth its weight in gold, and whoever has it rules the world. Thus, within half an hour after the announcement of the late Alan Campbell's inheritance, Frank Parker knew the ins and outs of this interesting case. But Alan had made a mess of it. Sued the tramp for everything. That's a laugh. What was he thinking when he signed those papers? Frank was indignant. "Maybe it's not so clear-cut, Mr. Parker," timidly asked Gregory's manager. The businessman raised an eyebrow in surprise. "That you really think so? Is this tramp a dark horse?" "And that's exactly what I'm thinking. We should put a little man on him," Mr. Parker Gregory replied. "Let him check it out. At the same time, they'll prepare the ground for the introduction of their own men into Campbell's company. We don't need that kind of competition. We'll take the business and be done with it." Parker looked at the deputy with satisfaction. He's raised a good wolfhound for himself. Too bad he has no children of his own. It's all the prison's fault. Yes, Alan, rest in peace. Lada and Grisha, do it this way. Don't spare any money, let's hire the best detective. Let me be provided with all the background of this vagrant, where he was born and by whom he was baptized. Anyway, it's not for me to tell you Artem could hardly have known that a real drama was unfolding behind his back. The two feuding families of Campbell and Parker were desperately trying to figure out what the new heir and head of the company was all about. What is it? A sober calculation by the late Alan, or a fatal mistake that has no place in modern business? No one knew the answer to that. And first of all, Artem himself, who found himself in the epicenter of the confrontation between the powers that be. Be that as it may, but he had to prove his right to life, which meant that Artem had to fight to the end. The next morning he put on the best clothes he had and went to the office of his trading company. The guard at the entrance greeted Artem unfriendly. He reached for his baton when his partner deftly intercepted his hand at the very last moment. "Are you completely crazy? This is the new owner? His father's will gave him the company. Well, don't even think about it. Unless you're sick of the job, the owner. Why does he look like a beggar? Is that a trend now? Or is he faking it for the IRS?" Ben smiled as he watched the two guards squabble. He was used to this reaction and took it for granted. Predictably, the office greeted the new owner with even more animosity. Emma whispered to her friend, "William Jackson would have been better off handing the company over to Brian. He's so handsome." "Oh, come on, you'd better tell Jason," objected manager Eileen. Ben said hello and walked into his office. There was everything for the future businessman's comfort. A full wall shelf of books, a solid desk, an aquarium with many fish, and a huge plasma TV. But most of all, Ben liked the big, comfortable leather chair on wheels. Oh, what a job. Now I'd like to sit in such a chair, make myself comfortable and watch a simple movie for my own pleasure. Happiness. At that moment, Emma came into the office. "Ben, can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee?" Ben shook his head in embarrassment. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it had to be taken to the fullest. At first, everything seemed foreign to Ben. Contracts, managers, leasing. At some point, he just wanted to run away from this inheritance. But then he pulled himself together, realizing that he could not betray the man who believed in him. A day passed, a second, a week. Without realizing it, Ben had gotten caught up in the work, relying on Amber's deputy for guidance. Amber was a spectacular woman in her 30s who had men looking at her. She was the one who had quietly taken Ben under her wing. He made his own decisions, but with a gentle nudge from Amber, who acted carefully and tactfully. "Look at that, the deputy's no slouch. She'll have Ben in her sights soon enough," Emily's secretary once told her friend Eileen. "I don't think so. I think you're exaggerating. What could they possibly have in common?" Eileen's opinion was shared by more than half the office, who realized that Amber wasn't that simple, and the staff was right. Amber had a secret that only one person knew about. Once a week, Amber rented a hotel room where she had a meeting with a very important man, Jason Campbell. As soon as she stepped into the room, Amber heard a familiar voice say, "So, how are you doing? Did you manage to tame that underdog?" Amber smiled enigmatically. "I think so." "What's the point of all this, Jason? What's the point?" The young businessman grinned. Amber had long been his informant in the company and had supplied him with valuable information. Now, however, she had a special assignment. "Why would I want to do all this? To make this fool tame. Once he believes you unconditionally, through a few failed deals, I'll bring the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Then I'll bring up the question of removing this tramp to the board of directors." "How can you do that? He's the heir." "Yes, he is. His late father personally wrote such a clause to curb businessmen who play games. Now we're going to turn that weapon against his favorite." Amber smiled understandingly. She liked Jason's plan as much as she liked Jason himself, with whom she'd had a long affair known to few. But Amber wasn't afraid of possible gossip. After discussing the details of the upcoming affair, the couple moved smoothly into the bedroom, where the conversation turned to more pleasant topics. Sitting in his office, Frank Parker was eagerly awaiting news from his manager Gregory. The latter had promised to provide him with some truly killer material. "Let's see what your detective has unearthed," Frank thought, glancing at his watch now and then. The businessman was very concerned about the situation around the new owner of his competitor's company. "Who is this Ben and where did he come from?" Parker was brought out of his anxious thoughts by the sound of the door opening. On the threshold stood Gregory with a folder in his hands. "May I, Frank?" "Yeah, come on in." "Well, tell me, what have you got?" "Just a little report, but I'd still like to put it into words." Frank smiled. "Come on, did you dig up anything hot? Like, wow." Gregory shrugged uncertainly, then said, "This Ben is an orphan, a pupil of an orphanage. His mother's dead." Frank wrinkled his nose. "Well, what is it, father?" "Come on, don't stall, time is of the essence." "His father's a recidivist felon, not a murderer, though. No blood on him. More like a poor guy who stole, drank, went to jail. Romance, in a word. When his wife was alive, he kept it together, but then he went off the rails. 7 priors, all for theft. But he never touched the poor. He only stole from the rich. Kind of like Robin Hood, but with a new twist. Look at Ben's background." Frank smiled. "Curly-haired, that's for sure. Only he didn't know his father. He'd been in an orphanage since he was 2 years old. Sometimes after a successful case, his father would send him small gifts, candy or toys. Anonymously, of course. But shortly before he died, he found his son. They say they even reconciled. Where's his daddy now?" Frank couldn't resist. "In a cemetery. 2 weeks before Alan Campbell died. Stephen got smart then. He got a job in a cab company. He didn't work much, though. An accident. Drunk driver swerved into oncoming traffic. Stephen didn't stand a chance. Went into a ditch. It's a sad story. And they say he was dating Campbell shortly before he died." Frank raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Who? The father or the son?" Gregory smiled meaningfully. "Alan." The businessman visibly tensed. "Why? Why would Campbell be dating an ex-recidivist? What could possibly connect them? And why would he include his son Ben in his will right afterward? I don't like this. I'm sensing Alan was up to something again. May he rest in peace. But why would he want that convict?" Frank said thoughtfully. The manager shook his head in the negative. He did not know the answer to that question, and only the late Alan could give it. But you can't ask the dead, as you know. "What about the firm? What are our informants saying? Does the boy have any business talent? Or is he just an empty shell?" Frank asked. "You know those diplomas mean nothing to me. Sometimes total losers become millionaires, and professors peddle in crosswalks. It takes guts. Guts." "I don't know yet, Frank. Deputy Campbell's got him under his wing over there. I think he's been messing around with him. It's been a while." Frank frowned. The businessman knew at once where the wind was blowing. He didn't want his son Brian in Alan's place. Jason was abrasive, hot-tempered. Guys like him could make a mess of things. But before he did, he'd sink not only himself, but his competitors as well. If Brian took the reins, things would be a lot more fun. He's the kind of jerk you can control with 2 fingers, no problem. He doesn't need anything but women and booze. Frank didn't want to do the Campbell heirs any harm, but to teach them a lesson. Yes, but he wasn't ready for anything more than that, and primarily because of Emily, whom he still loved with all his heart. Of course, there had been affairs in his life, and more than one, but Frank had kept his sincere feelings for only one woman. If Alan hadn't planted that injunction on me then, things might have turned out very differently, he thought. Life would have gone on in Rochester, enjoying life, raising sons. But maybe all was not lost yet. We still have a life to live. Mourning for her husband is understandable, but life doesn't stand still, the businessman pondered. Gregory interpreted the chief's silence as a signal that the conversation was over. He knew from experience that at such times it was better to leave discreetly. That way there would be fewer questions and possible complaints. In the meantime, Ben continued to learn the ways of business under Amber's tacit supervision. The cunning began, skillfully leading him to a trap that would slam shut after a couple or 3 failed deals. Soon we'll be rid of this upstart, and in control of everything like we used to be, Jason told his brother. Yeah, that would be nice, sure. But you know how I feel, don't you? I need a good manager, and the company will take care of itself, Brian objected. Jason had his own way of looking at the situation. He intended to sneak Ben out of the company and send him back to wherever he'd come from. Jason had no idea what Ben had gone through to get to this high position. He didn't remember his mother, and he'd only recently found his father. He'd lost him right away. Ben didn't know why Alan Campbell had left him such a lavish inheritance. For what merit, when he'd never even seen him? Sitting in his office, Ben couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to him. He hadn't become a vagrant by accident. The fire that broke out because of faulty wiring in his old house was to blame, although Ben himself suspected that it was something else. There were not enough apartments for everyone, and often orphans were given housing in the suburbs. Ben was disliked in the town, considered a thief for some inexplicable reason. Everyone who had passed through the walls of the orphanage was considered such. But we weren't taught to steal there. Why does everyone think otherwise? Ben said with resentment in his voice. No one in the town believed him, except Laura, a nice, sweet girl, daughter of a local farmer, John Smith. They'd met by chance at the town day party. The tables were set. There was rousing music, to the rhythms of which everyone from small to large danced. May I ask you to dance? Laura heard a pleasant male voice. She turned her head to the right and immediately saw Ben, an orphan boy who had gotten a house in their town. Invite him over, she smiled. At that moment, Laura had no idea that this very dance would bind their hearts together. Not immediately, of course, but after a while, in spite of Laura's father's inhibitions, who was looking at a very different fiancé. No, just because he's an orphan with no family, and you're not one to be afraid. The boys in town are afraid to court me. My father forbade it. Can you believe it? He's got a lot of leverage. A lot of the suitors' parents work on his farm, so he makes it pretty clear. And you're not like that, Laura said proudly, looking at the smoothness of the evening lake. Why should I be afraid? I'm my own man, and your father is not as harsh as he seems, is he? Harsh, yes. But he's not scary, Ben said. He had no idea where his self-confidence would eventually lead him. John Smith had only warned him to begin with, but the boy still did his own thing and continued to date his daughter. The second warning was more severe, but Ben stood up to it. But the third, in fact, was no more. Ben's house burned down when he went into town on business. When he came back, the guy found only smoldering ashes, around which the locals walked with a sad look. According to the official version, faulty electrical wiring was to blame. But Ben felt that it was not only about it. It was not for nothing that Smith had sent his daughter to visit distant relatives immediately after the fire. And it was done deliberately, to isolate the young people from each other and deprive them of the opportunity to communicate normally. Having lost the roof over his head and his favorite girl, Ben went to the city, where his father found him after a while, but not for long, because he himself died, and now this unexpected inheritance. Ben was brought out of his sad thoughts by the sound of a text message on his phone. What? Is it happening again? And who is always sending me these messages, not hiding his irritation? Ben exclaimed. The thing was that for the second week he had been receiving strange messages on his phone. The sender's number was hidden, and Ben could only read the messages without being able to reply. Today's anonymous text message read, "Watch out for Amber." A little earlier, the messages had been less informative, along the lines of trust no one. Study the contract in detail. By and large, the texts weren't negative and were intended more for caution and guidance than for harm. But there was no one for Ben to consult. Even after the fire, she'd never called him. And it wasn't a good idea to trust Amber's deputy, according to the anonymous tipster. All right, I'll try to be careful. Business is a very unpleasant business. Everyone here wears more than one mask at a time, Ben whispered. Some days he felt like a mouse in a terrarium full of hungry snakes. Ben, we hated everyone from Farmer Jackson to the late Campbell's heirs. What in God's name did I ever do to them all? Eat your inheritance. What do I need it for? What did I do to deserve this honor? Ben puzzled. That's when Amber entered the office like a cat. Ben, are you ready to close the deal? Tomorrow is the deadline for payment. It'll be too late, and the partners won't forgive that, she said. Ben hesitated for a moment. You see, the words from today's anonymous immediately came to mind. Watch out for Amber. Why should I watch out for her? She's a nice, kind woman. And she doesn't look like a con artist, he thought. Besides, she's been with the company for years. A couple minutes later, Ben agreed to the deal. Amber smiled radiantly and immediately approved of the young executive's choice. The praise of the spectacular woman made Ben blossom like the dew of May. It was understandable. A kind word is nice to anyone. And while he was preparing for important negotiations on the other side of the city, other events were developing. Tired of languishing in ignorance, Frank Parker decided to talk to Emily Campbell and directly offer help. They say that old love does not rust, provided that they had it. Of course, that very love. To Frank's surprise, Emily was receptive to his offer. "All right, let's meet, if we can meet on my property." "Okay, no kids, so the conversation won't be interrupted," she agreed. "Yes, I agree. I'll be there," of course, Frank whispered like a boy. The last thing on his mind at that moment was that he was actually going to the lair of his enemy, albeit a dead one, but still. All day Frank had been thinking only of the coming meeting. What would they say to each other? So many years had passed. Sure, they'd seen each other at the funeral, but only briefly. This is different. His heart was jumping out of his chest with excitement. Frank, who dreamed of only one thing, to see Emily as soon as possible, by the appointed time already stood in front of the house, in which he had never been before. Emily met him at the entrance and escorted him into the living room. There was already a small table with a couple cups, coffee and scones. Still unable to cope with his inner turmoil, Frank talked nonsense that had nothing to do with what he had wanted to say earlier. Emily listened in silence, only occasionally inserting a word or two to keep the conversation going. But when Frank spoke of his feelings, Emily's expression darkened and her voice became metallic. "I'm sorry, Frank, there's something I need to tell you. That criminal case when they found the illegal drugs in your pocket, well, it was me who planted them on you, not Alan, as you thought. Why are you defending Alan?" "Emily, slow down, let the guest come to his senses a little bit. When I made my choice, it was Alan. But your jealousy wouldn't let us live in peace. I know your temper. That's why I decided to be so mean, even though I realized it was a mistake." "I'm sorry," she said guiltily. Frank's face contorted. "Your mistake cost me 5 years of my life. Not a day went by that I didn't curse Alan for being mean, and you did this." Emily lowered her eyes and covered her face with her hands, crying softly. Frank sat there thinking about how cruel fate can be at times. For a moment, they were so engrossed in their painful memories that they didn't even hear the front door open. On the doorstep stood Jason, who had come back for his forgotten cell phone. "What's going on here? Why are you crying? Did that guy hurt you in some way? Watch your language, son." "I didn't hurt anybody. Don't you see adults are talking here?" "Go play in the sandbox." Jason couldn't help himself, so he threw his fists at Frank. The two men were roughly evenly matched, Jason's side being youthful and intense, while Frank's side was dominated by experience and physical strength. Clawing at each other, the men were ready to tear each other apart like two hungry dogs finding a bone. Emily tried to separate the fighting men, but it was not easy. They clashed like a couple of bulldogs in a back alley. Then Emily said out loud something that made Jason and Frank freeze. "Jason, stop it, let go. It's your father." The boy immediately loosened his grip. After giving Frank a chance to break free of his grip, his arms went limp, and his lips trembled treacherously. "How's father?" The question might have sounded too harsh, but Jason didn't care. Emily sighed sadly. "That's just it, Jason. It happens in life, unfortunately. I was already pregnant when I broke up with Frank, but not with your father." Frank turned pale, after which he asked, "So Alan knew that?" "Knew it, of course. I told him the truth right away. I was fed up with the lies at that point." "Why didn't you tell him? What difference would it have made?" "I only loved Alan." The dumbfounded son sank down in his chair and wrapped his arms around his head. For so many years he had lived with the idea that Frank was an enemy to him, and now it turned out that he had practically no nearer and more kindred man. The spirit of rivalry and hatred was slowly fading in Frank's soul, as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water on the hot coals. Jason and Frank spent the rest of the evening talking about their past and future. Father and son definitely had a lot to talk about, especially since they were only now learning the truth about each other. The next morning, Ben set out, as planned, to close his first big deal. By Jason's design, it and all subsequent ones were going to be a failure. But Ben didn't know that, and he was ready to sign his own name to his failure. When he entered the office, he invited representatives of the partnership firm to review the documents and sign the contract for both parties. Amber was impatient as she imagined the possible consequences of the deal, and there was a ringing silence in the office. As Ben picked up the pen and prepared to sign, everyone present froze. And at that moment, the door swung open and a tall, gray-haired man appeared on the threshold. "Ben, wait, don't do that." The businessman looked up and nearly fainted at what he saw. Standing before him was none other than Alan Campbell, alive and well. "Oh my God," Amber gasped and collapsed. Some of the guests rushed to her aid, trying to bring her to her senses with a splash of water. For Ben, literally couldn't move from the shock that engulfed him. Was it really possible for a dead man to come back to life weeks after his own funeral? But Alan didn't look like a reanimated dead man at all. Not only that, he looked more alive than anyone else. "You don't sign those papers, Ben. I know about the plot against you. I'm the one who sent you the text message warning," the businessman added. And having thrown a heavy superior look at everyone present, the representatives of the front company immediately preferred to retreat, taking Amber with them, who had already managed to come to her senses. Left alone with Ben, Alan locked the door and said, So how's running the firm treating you? What are your impressions? What impressions? Especially when things like this happen, Ben replied with barely contained excitement. The businessman smiled. You mean this masquerade? Sorry. It's just the way it is. By all canons, I should have died, but I survived. It was your father's heart that saved me. Yeah, you heard him. Turns out he bequeathed his organs to the Dahmer Center in case he died. The heart grafted perfectly, and for good reason. What other reasons? Ben asked in a trembling voice. This amount of information made his head feel like a burning beehive right now. Campbell hesitated for a moment, then continued, I was immediately confused by such an amazing compatibility. Later, after the operation, the doctors did a comparative DNA test. After that, it turned out that your father and I are brothers. Basically, we're brothers. You know, I don't know how that happened. I, like you, grew up in an orphanage, and I just don't have anyone to ask about it. I guess we got separated. It happens a lot. Maybe there's another reason. But what's the point of digging into it now, when your father died a violent death, but he prolonged my life? I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I did all of this in an atmosphere of strict secrecy about the fact that I was alive. Even my wife Emily didn't know. I had to check how my sons would act in the event of my death. How would they take the will? Would they be able to adapt to their new life? I was tired of carrying everything on my back, so I compromised my health. Ben listened silently, as if mesmerized. The story seemed so unreal that only a madman could believe it. But Ben believed it, for he saw tears in Campbell's eyes. Sincere, and at the same time a heavy weight fell from the boy's shoulders. Now Ben no longer needed to understand the intricacies of running a business he never understood anything about. Embracing his uncle, he felt peace and comfort for the first time in his life after the failed negotiations. Campbell didn't take it personally. Moreover, the businessman even kept the seat for Amber, realizing that she was acting at the behest of his eldest son. Since the rumor of Campbell's miraculous resurrection spread across the city at the speed of light, Frank was the first to know about it, so he came to greet him in person. Now that there was no animosity between them, they could shake hands as in the good old days. I'm sorry, buddy, I overreacted. I accused you unsubstantiated. It wasn't your fault, was it? Frank whispered. Alan smiled. Oh, come on, he remembers old times as the one who's out of sight. I was good too. Contrary to everyone's belief that Campbell would remove Ben from the company after his resurrection, he didn't, and Alan had his reasons. First, after learning who his real father was, Jason decided to link his life with the Parkers' business. Brian had no desire to become his father's successor, therefore Campbell had no better candidate than his nephew. However, now Ben managed the business under his supervision, which made the task much easier. 5 years passed. During that time, the Campbells had become so close that from the outside they seemed like a tight-knit family. Jason helped his father in the business, but he didn't harm Ben, and on the contrary, gave him good advice, although, to some extent, they were already unnecessary. After all, the former drifter had become a real business shark. Now he was no longer frightened by the intricacies of business negotiations, in which he navigated like a student in a school library. At Alan's suggestion, Ben decided to look for Laura, whose image he still kept in his memory. But now Ben arrived in an expensive car of the latest model, which caused a great commotion in the village. Look, Ben's here today, the grandmothers whispered on the benches. But when the door of the house opened, Ben was in for another surprise. Laura came out not alone, but with a little boy about 4 or 5 years old. Holding his mom's hand, the boy looked at the outlandish car and smiled. Mom, who is that? The little boy asked. Ben lowered his eyes in embarrassment, realizing that he had shown up too late, and therefore there was nothing he could change. It's your daddy, son, Laura replied in a trembling voice, still not believing herself. Ben jumped up to her and hugged her and her son tightly. God, is it really true? His heart jumped out of his chest as his lips kissed her face. Kristen ran home, opened the door, and found herself in the dark silence of the hallway. She realized with secret relief that it seemed like no one was home, which meant she would have time to cook dinner. As usual, throwing her bag on the nightstand, she kicked off her shoes and moved towards the kitchen. But before reaching it, she suddenly stopped, waved her hand, and abruptly changing direction, entered the room. She sat down on the sofa, leaned back, and closed her eyes with pleasure. How good it is to just sit down and do nothing for at least a while. Kristen suddenly clearly realized how tired she was. This was not the kind of fatigue that any person experiences after a hard day of work, some task requiring physical exertion, or, for example, after a sleepless night. Kristen's fatigue was somehow endless, hopeless, overwhelming. And if she could get rid of the first one by simply resting and speaking out, then it was still unclear what she should do with her feelings. Her whole life in the last few years had been like an endless race in a circle. Housework, work, Andrew, child. In general, everything was familiar, ordinary, like everyone else. Millions of women live in exactly the same way, but no one considers this something special, does not lament the injustice in women's lot, or complains about fate. Take, for example, her best, in fact, if you look at it, her only friend since school. Her position is the head of the legal department of a huge commercial company, with a bunch of people subordinate to her. Of course, the salary is more than decent, but the responsibility is scary to think about. And not only for yourself, but also for others. By the way, there are 3 children and a husband. Or, as Helen jokingly calls him, my eldest child, hinting at some immaturity of her dear person. At home, Helen fundamentally does everything herself, although it is unclear when and how she gets everything done, given the size of their apartment, the presence in it of 3 teenagers, a large dog and a scientist husband, a man, to put it mildly, not practical. How, despite all this, she managed to maintain her blooming appearance and cheerful disposition from year to year was a huge mystery to everyone. For everyone except Lena, who, flashing a smile, told Kristen, I've been telling you the same thing for many years, you need to love and respect yourself. Understand, Kristen brushed aside her friend's words, considering it a hackneyed and meaningless phrase. She believed that she certainly respected herself. Just how can this feeling help her to do everything, and most importantly, to feel as easy and calm, to be as humanly happy as the same Helen? She didn't understand. Well, from tomorrow a completely different life begins. And she herself, Kristen, a 33-year-old woman who just a few years ago, no one had ever given her age, and now looking 50 years old, will never be the same. She will be fine. Kristen was raised by her mother. The girl did not remember her father. As her mother, whose name was Anne, later told her, he fell ill and died suddenly when Kristen was not yet 2 years old. Life turned out so that they had no one else in the world except each other. Mom, having buried her husband, did not even try to arrange her personal life anymore and devoted herself entirely to her daughter. Her whole life and every moment of it were devoted to the child. The girl's health from birth was poor. She was frankly behind her peers in height and energy. She was often sick, and Anne spent her first few years in constant fear that something terrible and irreparable was about to happen to her daughter. Mother, you cannot do it this way. An elderly pediatrician who had been observing Kristen since birth ironically reprimanded her. You will go crazy before your Kristen goes to school. For example, now a girl has a common cold, and you are panicking. As if we have identified a terrible infection in your child. Having matured a little, Kristen became stronger and almost caught up with the children of her age. And yet she still remained fragile, touching and defenseless. She spoke little, and almost always kept her head slightly lowered. And her favorite pastime from early childhood was drawing. Anna had no education other than school. She worked as a cloakroom attendant in the city theater, and of course their family did not have much money left. While Kristen was little, this did not affect her life in any way. On the contrary, she considered her mother's work to be the best, because the girl could watch all the performances for free. And the New Year holidays with successive children's performances, which she watched one after another, not paying attention to the repeating plots of the same characters, generally turned into a continuous holiday for her. What is unimportant and invisible to a baby looks completely different to a teenager. Growing up, Kristen, of course, could not help but notice that she was the worst in the class. She was poorly dressed. She had the oldest briefcase, a gift from one of the neighbors. And in physical education class, she wore the funniest sneakers, the kind you can only see in old photographs, and not sneakers like everyone else. She watched in amazement as her classmates defiantly threw money out of their pockets in front of each other, showed off their belongings, and discussed family trips to seaside resorts and the upcoming holidays. Despite this, it never occurred to Kristen to blame her mother for anything. She saw that she was doing everything she could for her daughter. She just could do very little. Her health failed her at times. Small, thin, she, giving her growing daughter an extra, sweeter piece, lived practically from hand to mouth, and from year to year wore the same drafty coat and boots, the soles of which had long let in everything they stepped on. And what only the soul holds on to. So skinny. The neighbors shook their heads, watching Anne as she always hurried somewhere. But what Kristen understood and patiently endured, her peers could not understand and tolerate. With the harshness and cruelty characteristic of many teenagers, they hurled vile words in her direction, at first in a whisper, not really understanding the inadmissibility of this. But with age they did it more and more consciously. At the beginning of the next school year, The class in which Kristen studied was supposed to go on an excursion to a neighboring city. The guys were, of course, excited about the upcoming trip and heatedly discussed it and made plans. One of the points of the program was a visit to the opera and ballet theater famous throughout the country. Kristen, who has loved theatrical performances since childhood, was looking forward to this particular event with special interest and already knew the theater's repertoire and the schedule of performances by heart. We should go to this theater, discussed the guys, who for the most part were not delighted with the attempts to introduce them to high art. It would be better if we went to the zoo. What is there to even see? Who knows what we will watch? Carmen Kristen suddenly announced with unusual excitement. Her voice sounded unexpectedly loud, and everyone turned in her direction. Are you planning to go too? Suddenly Kristen asked the most beautiful, by everyone's own opinion, girl in the class, Sarah. Kristen looked around hauntedly and felt her ears begin to burn. Ugh. You will disgrace us in front of everyone, said Sarah. I can imagine what you will wear to the theater. Probably in that terrible sundress, knitted, with flowers, which you wore on March 8th. By the way, if you think this is festive clothing, then I want to disappoint you. This is clothing for a stuffed animal. Why did you go and take off that sundress from him? Kristen felt tears boiling in her eyes. She lowered her head low, and a warm drop fell on her hand. You better shut up, princess. Suddenly a ringing voice was heard in the class, which easily drowned out the disgusting sycophantic giggles of the children. Otherwise, you yourself won't be able to go anywhere, because I will spank you. You will sit at home and change lotions on your black eye. Understood? Kristen wiped her eyes and raised her head in front of Lyra. With her fists on her sides, stood a girl named Helen. Everyone knew better than to mess with her. Not only has she been seriously involved in some type of martial arts for a long time and can easily beat not only Sarah, but also any of the boys, but she also has a brother, Victor, who studies in high school. And everyone again knows that Victor is the guy is athletic, serious and authoritative. What are you doing? Sarah asked in amazement. Are you standing up for this scarecrow? You yourself, scarecrow, she retorted. And in general, if anyone comes to her again or says something nasty, they will have to deal with me, okay? Thank you, Kristen said quietly, getting closer to her unexpected intercessor at the next break. What? Helen asked. What are you muttering there? I don't understand. And anyway, why do you always talk as if you're going to die? I'm saying. Kristen took a deep breath and spoke louder. Thank you for helping me. Oh, nonsense, Helen waved it off. Sarah should have been put in her place a long time ago. My mistress, too. She became completely insolent. Yes, and it's your own fault. Why are you silent? You always endure like some kind of sheep. Do you like being insulted? And anyway, why are you some kind of orphan? And I am an orphan. Kristen laughed quietly. Well, that is half. I only have my mother. Oh, excuse me, please, Kristen. Helen was confused. I haven't paid attention to such little things for a long time. Well, anyway, thank you again for standing up for me. Kristen nodded and turned to leave and sit at the last desk, where she almost always sat alone. Hey, you wait. Helen moved decisively after her. Come on, you will sit with me now. Like this? Kristen was confused. But Oleg is sitting with you. Just think, Oleg is sitting. It's okay. It means he'll change seats. Oleg, Helen barked at the whole class, turning to one of her classmates. Quickly pull yourself together and go to the last desk. Her eyesight is poor. She needs to sit closer to the board. From that day on, Kristen's life, at least at school, changed dramatically. She no longer felt like an outcast, and people began to greet her. At first, stuttering, forced, with an eye on the omnipresent Helen, and then simply and habitually, because this is normal. Kristen has become a much better student. It turned out that she has an excellent memory. But the most important thing is that everyone learned about her talent. To the first secret, and then obvious admiration of her class, it turned out that she draws incredibly well. Kristen has even changed in appearance for the better. She stopped clenching herself as she had done before, as if trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. And then, to everyone's amazement, it turned out that Kristen was actually very good at something. Anna inherited from her mother fragility, grace, good, thick, slightly curly hair, dark brown, slightly red, long eyelashes, and beautiful, even white teeth, which everyone finally saw after their owner began to smile. All this became very noticeable in high school. Ellen never gave up on anything halfway, and having taken a kind of patronage over Kristen, she did not limit herself to forcing the class to accept Kristen and begin to treat her normally. A few days after the memorable conversation, she dragged her new friend to her home. Then she introduced her classmate to her parent. "Mom, let's give her my jeans." "Well, those that didn't bother me after the summer." "Well, maybe there's more." Her mother, looking at her compassionate child with a smile, turned her eyes to thin Kristen. She knew the girl, of course. "I heard about her difficult fate and the cheerful life of her small family." "Yes, please, I don't mind," she nodded. "But if Kristen herself doesn't mind, of course, bring the jeans. And remember, if you don't stop eating so much bread, you'll soon be able to give Kristen all your clothes." "Come on," Kristen Helen mumbled, thrusting almost new pants into Kristen's hands. "They're just lying there anyway. And what do you give me for this?" "Well, I don't know, I came up with an idea. You will draw my portrait." By her senior year, things were looking up for Kristen. Helen's efforts and care showed, and Kristen herself became a completely different person. Soon, the highlight of the school exhibition were ironic drawings and cartoons by Kristen, in which the children recognized themselves and each other with delight and amazement. After this, Kristen became, if not a star, then at least a person whose unconditional abilities were recognized by everyone at school. In addition, she is the class beauty of the class. Kristen's longtime follower, Sarah, suddenly became covered with teenage acne, and Kristen, on the contrary, blossomed with some special, subtle, translucent girlish beauty. Beauty that not everyone notices, but which cannot be forgotten once you see it. After graduating from school, Kristen entered art school. The girl had no prior preparation. However, during the creative exam, Kristen, fulfilling the examiner's assignment, really shined and was accepted. "You are very gifted," one of the admissions committee members told her. "You have an amazing innate sense of composition and color. But you have poor technical skills and are not at all prepared in terms of theory. You need to work a lot and read in your specialty, dear girl. Well, for example, let's take this portrait from your portfolio. It is, of course, very interesting in the manner of execution, but at the same time it contains a lot of mistakes." Well, look, the teacher launched into long, lengthy analyses of her work. By the way, a portrait of Lena. And Kristen listened to her work with delight. "How can he even judge my portrait if he has never seen me? The portrait is awesome. Everyone says this, see, it looks like me. Well, just like a photograph, only 100 times better. I've never looked good in photos, but here it's so great." Helen, he wasn't talking about the similarity, but about technical errors. But, you know, the composition itself, proportions, light and shade, plasticity. "Oh, okay, don't bother me with all this. I still won't understand anything. You draw just great." Kristen enjoyed studying at school and drew every free minute of her life. Helen, with her characteristic practicality, declared that not everyone can be great creators. Someone needs to earn money, and she entered the university to study law. The girls, of course, saw each other much less frequently than when they were at school, but they still constantly maintained friendly relations. Kristen felt more than just gratitude towards Helen for the fact that her friend had once, in fact, completely changed her life. She saw Helen as an older sister, and the latter, on the contrary, having taken part in the fate of a school outcast several years ago, was sincerely proud of her friend and perceived her as the younger sister she never had. Things were going very well for Kristen at school. She was really talented. Her work was noted as one of the best. And after a couple of years, they started talking about her as a young artist with her own style. "You see, girl," the elderly teacher who was their course leader explained to her with inspiration, "an artist is not someone who can draw a cat or a tree exactly as it looks in reality or in a photograph. This is not an artist. This is a copying machine. And an artist is someone who lives in his own world and knows how to show this world to others with light, form, and strokes. Here you have it, this sketch, for example. God knows how you managed to make me see an old man here." Kristen laughed along with the teacher and meticulously looked at the sheet from which, framed by gray hair swaying in the wind, the prickly, stern gaze of a wise elderly man peered into her. Time fled, and my studies at the school quickly ended. She received a diploma as an artist teacher, and with it a complete lack of understanding of what to do next. At the graduation ceremony, the rector told her, "Well, you are perhaps one of our most talented students in recent times. But unfortunately, in modern times, this is not enough. You need opportunities, time, a workshop, tools, materials. Yes, in general, To become an artist, you need money, no matter how bad it may sound. And to become a great artist, you need a lot of money." The man paused and sighed heavily. "Still, I wish you success. Maybe not now, later, someday, but your gift certainly deserves it." Hearing this was both pleasant and scary at the same time. But Kristen didn't want to think about her fate yet. She was young, beautiful, happy, and all the thoughts of her and her former classmates were occupied with their graduation evening. They decided to celebrate their graduation at the highest level, in a fashionable nightclub. Mom gave her daughter silver earrings. They were made in the form of the thinnest leaves, which intertwined with each other and ended in an elegant flower with a small diamond in the center. Mom, what a miracle. Kristen took a long time to come to her senses and didn't even realize right away. "How are you? Where did you get the money?" Anne finished asking her daughter. "Well, honey, your mother is not such a loser that she couldn't save up for a gift for her only girl." Kristen's nose stung and her eyes itched. And then Kristen put on her dress, prepared for going out to the club, and now it was Anne's turn to sigh in admiration and wipe her eyes. Only she did it without hiding, and without hiding her happy tears. The dress was extraordinary, very simple, straight, with almost no details. It was made of elastic, but at the same time dense fabric. The dress fit her figure like a glove, creating a silhouette of incredible beauty and femininity. The rather deep cutout on the back was absolutely breathtaking. The color of the fabric was in great harmony with the loose, light chestnut curls, and the light, barely noticeable makeup only emphasized the calm, somehow unusual, as if a little not modern, and this made it even more attractive, beauty of the girl. When Kristen appeared among her classmates, everyone simply gasped. She read undisguised admiration in the guy's eyes. But many girls looked at her with poorly concealed envy. All these sensations were completely unusual for Kristen, and made her head spin no less than the light wine that the waiter periodically poured into her. The party was in full swing. The music and conversations became louder, faces became hotter, and the behavior of those around them became freer. Many of the guys went dancing, and Kristen, who had never been to this kind of place before, watched with curiosity what was happening on the dance floor. "Can I bother you?" She heard a man's voice above her. Kristen raised her head. A young man stood in front of her. With the tenacious gaze of an artist, she instantly took in all the details, noted the harmonious facial features, figure, neatly styled blonde hair, and most importantly, incredibly beautiful hands with long fingers and surprisingly graceful wrists for a man. She immediately drew attention to his hands, because the man was holding in them an amazingly beautiful, blooming rose on a long stem. How beautiful, the girl burst out completely involuntarily. "It is for you." He handed her a flower dash a beautiful rose for the most beautiful girl in the club. "Well, why are you embarrassed, Kristen?" "No need. After all, it turns out that I begged her from you. How can I put it?" It turns out he laughed cheerfully. "Although no, of course I brought it just for you as a bribe." "Bribery?" she asked again incomprehensibly. "Yes, bribery." The guy smiled. His smile was extremely charming. I immediately wanted to smile back. I just thought that if I tried to give you a flower and you accepted it, it would be awkward for you to refuse me the dance. "I'll take the rose from you, but I still won't go dancing." "But why?" He looked really and truly upset. "You don't like me at all." "Not at all, not a bit. And you can't even stand me for one dance?" "No, why? You are very pretty. I just don't know how to dance at all." "Well, not a bit. Moreover." The conversation that took place between them under the roar of club music was, of course, a simple and light track, without any pretensions to content. It was a non-binding conversation between a guy and a girl. They were a little inspired by the atmosphere, music, drinking, youth, and freedom. Kristen, for the first time feeling so liberated about her attractiveness and femininity, the power of all this over men, did not recognize herself at all. It seemed that there were no barriers, no conventions, no obligations, nothing that would prevent her from cheerfully chatting about anything with this terribly handsome guy, saying words that a few hours ago she would have been embarrassed to even think. "I can't do that either," the guy waved his hand. "You know, there's another establishment not far from here. It's very decent. It has a completely different atmosphere and wonderful live music. Perhaps you would agree to continue the evening there? I invite you, please do not refuse. You know, today is my birthday. It so happened that I was left alone. If you would agree to sit with me for a while, it would be the best gift for me. Please." He folded his hands in some kind of prayerful gesture, and Kristen once again involuntarily noted their grace. She looked around uncertainly. Many of the former students were already pretty tipsy. Until recently, the funny crowd had broken up into couples and groups, and one could be sure that hardly anyone would notice its disappearance. She looked again at her new acquaintance. He was so attractive, dressed in a white shirt, black trousers, and a formal jacket. He stood out among the drunken denim crowd, like a noble hare among mules. But most importantly, he looked at her with such admiration, and this look excited her so much that her legs lifted Kristen from the table. "Well, even though I don't understand what's going on and why I'm behaving this way, I agree," she said. "Thank you." The guy's eyes darkened. He gallantly pulled his hand away and offered it to Kristen. "Oh, wait." She suddenly stopped and laughed. "What is this, really? I'm almost ready to go with you to God knows where, and I don't even know your name." "Sorry, it's my fault. I lost my head." He smiled sweetly and spread his arms, bowing playfully. "Let me introduce myself, Andrew." "Kristen." She curtsied. "Well, everyone, it seems like all the formalities have been completed. Let's go." He suddenly took her hand and quickly, as if fearing that they would be stopped, walked towards the exit. They were sitting in a small, cozy restaurant, which, after the roar and hustle and bustle of the club, felt unusually good. A wonderful tea rose stood in a vase with water. Kristen looked over the flower at Andrew, and she wanted this night to never end. "You promised me a dance," he suddenly said and extended his hand. "And you promised to teach me how to dance," she answered. His hand lay softly and tenderly on her waist. She put her hands on his shoulders and felt happy. Apparently, he sensed the moment and gently pulled her towards him. She took a deep breath. "You know, I have to go." Kristen literally forced herself to say these words. "Why did I somehow offend you?" He tried to look into the girl's eyes. No, what are you talking about?" Everything was amazing. It was a wonderful evening, maybe the best of my life. But it's already very late. But I will see you again. He persistently tried to catch her eye. "I don't know, I'm not sure if this is necessary. Maybe it's not worth it. Just let everything remain as it is." "Andrew, you are a wonderful guy. I had a very good time with you today. Happy birthday." Kristen stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. She approached the exit but could not stand it and turned around. Andrew sat at the table, looking after her in confusion. She laughed joyfully, returned, and stroked his hair. "Write down my phone number." It was incredibly easy for her. Everything seemed simple and natural. For the first time in her life, she simply did what she wanted without thinking about how right or decent it was. They started meeting every day. They walked around the city, sat on benches in the park, rowed a boat on the old pond, ate cakes in small summer cafes. "We're going to a restaurant this evening," he suddenly declared. "You should wear that amazing dress you wore to your prom." "Why is that?" Kristen was surprised. "Because today is our anniversary. It's been exactly a week since we met," Andrew solemnly announced. At first she laughed, but then realized that he was completely serious. And again there was a beautiful rose in a crystal glass, light wine and a gentle melody, Andrew's hands on her back and shoulders. "I was wrong when I told you that you were the most beautiful girl in the club," he whispered. That is, she was amazed, despite the bliss that overwhelmed her. "Are you trying to say that I'm not that good?" "I just want to say that you are the most beautiful girl in the world." What woman doesn't want to hear such words? Who among them can stand against them? They spent the night together. In a small but cozy apartment, Andrew. She woke up first and lay there for a long time, not believing what happened to her, trying to realize herself a completely new, different, alien, unfamiliar woman. Andrew was sleeping soundly, and Kristen was looking at him, afraid to move and frighten away the feeling of peace and happiness that covered her in a warm wave. He was lying on the edge of the bed, turned on his side. A dark lock of hair covered his face and hung over the edge of the sofa. He put his other hand under his cheek, and his long fingers tangled in his hair. Kristen quietly made her way to get the album and pencil that were always in her bag. Taking them and trying not to make noise, she sat down in a chair. The drawing appeared on the paper easily and quickly, but still she was not finished yet. Andrew stirred and opened his eyes. "What are you doing?" "Demand," he said, seeing her concentrated face. I'm drawing the most beautiful fingers I've ever seen." Kristen smiled. "Fingers?" Andrew asked in amazement and jumped up from the sofa and approached the girl. "What other fingers? Come on, show me. Why fingers? Is this the only thing attractive about me?" "You have very beautiful hands." "No, really. I noticed it immediately as soon as I saw you for the first time there, in the club." "Come on, stop it, you'll say the same." "I have stupid hands, small, like a girl's. Mom says that such hands are a shame for a man. Although everything about you really seems beautiful. Damn, this is just great. You are a real artist. Let me kiss you urgently for this. Come on, look at me." Helen, whom Kristen had not seen for several weeks, and looked at her friend with surprise. "Listen, what's wrong with you? You're just glowing. Kristen, admit it, what's going on? Fell in love or what?" Helen said the last phrase just like that, without thinking, and froze when she saw Kristen nodding vigorously, her eyes shining in her smile. "Wow," Helen said slowly. "Are you with a man? I thought this would never happen. So what, he's one of your crazy ones? Shaggy artist. Will you eat one briquette of instant noodles a day for 2 and draw imperishable masterpieces?" "No," Kristen laughed. "He's not one of us. He's completely different. Wonderful, gentle, smart. In general, it's clear. The best. A friend finished for her. And when will I be introduced to this miracle of miracles? I just really want to look at the prince. You know, in recent years I have been seeing horses more and more." By this time, Helen had been married to her classmate for 3 years and was raising little sons, twins. She and her husband truly loved each other. The sons, of course, were adored. The phrase about horses was most likely intended to emphasize the heroic build of her men. Soon Helen and Andrew met. He was polite, reserved, and seemed a little afraid. She carefully probed him with her gaze and her trademark irony. "Well, what can I tell you?" Helen hugged her friend by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. "You love him. It's obvious, and you're happy. Here he is. You know, it seemed to me." "Oh, okay, everything will be fine. I am so happy for you." Summer was ending. The best summer in Kristen's life was spent with her loved one. Kristen went to work at an art school and began teaching drawing to children of all ages. The business was, of course, not entirely profitable, but it brought Kristen a lot of pleasure. Every day, ideas for future paintings of my own raced through my head, and my folders were swelling with sketches. Mom looked in surprise at her daughter, who was either singing songs desperately and out of tune, or spinning around the room like a little girl, and sometimes she was just sitting on a small loggia, raising her face to the soft autumn sun, smiling happily. One September evening, Andrew came in looking somewhat excited. It took Kristen a long time to gain control of his spirit, his words, and finally spoke. "Kristen, in general, I told my family about you. You probably remember I told you I was not born here, I'm from." He said the name of a large village 50 kilometers from the city. "I have a large family, father, mother, grandfather, 2 uncles, 3 aunts. And this, mind you, I'm not talking about their wives and husbands." Despite the tension, Andrew suddenly laughed, obviously imagining his numerous relatives. "I also have 2 sisters and a younger brother. I have never counted my cousins, but there are even more of them. In general, I'm from a camp," he joked, having finished listing family members. Kristen listened with amazement about the family. She had no one in the world except her mother, and she simply could not imagine what it was like to have so many relatives. "Listen, you are a happy person," she said, "to have so many relatives who love you. Well, they want to get to know you, you know. And I promised that we would come next Saturday. But you know, I have to warn you, my mother. Well, how can I explain it to you? She is so very domineering. She loves everything to be the way she wants. Well, she was very surprised when I told about the fact that we are together, that you and I have a relationship. And she, of course, has a lot of questions at once, both about you and in general, you know. Understand." It seems Kristen smiled cheerfully, although inside, to be honest, everything was shaking. "And most likely, I am not at all the option that she wants for you." "Well, what does this have to do with it?" Andrew exclaimed. "Whether Mom wants it or not, it doesn't matter. Well, or rather, not really. Of course it doesn't." He was completely confused in his explanations, became confused, fell silent, and looked pitifully at Kristen. "Okay, I understand everything. Well, in fact, I understand perfectly well that I am not the most enviable option. Any mother in your place would not be very happy with such a girl for her son. You know, if I were your mother, I wouldn't even let someone like me on the threshold. Kristen laughed, trying to make fun of Andrew's excitement and her own fear of meeting his family. Finally, the day appointed for the trip arrived. Kristen brought herself to an extreme state of anxiety with anticipation and did not sleep all night the night before she was tormented by the question how to dress. Do I need to wear makeup and do my hair? What will they think if she appears, so to speak, in a simple way? He'll say he doesn't respect us at all, so he needs to be on parade. What if they think she came to show off? When they ask about her family, maybe they can somehow remain silent and not talk too much about it. Lord, why did she agree to this trip? On the other hand, sooner or later she will have to meet his family if she wants to be with Andrew, and she really wants to. Her friend calmed her down, advising her to calm down. You can't show them any weakness, otherwise they'll quickly sit on your neck. I would like to go with you, Helen. Kristen finished dreamily, imagining what a meeting with Andrew's relatives could turn into with the participation of a friend in the role of her lawyer. She laughed merrily. As always, Lena's reasoning worked flawlessly. Kristen calmed down and met Andrew, who was following her, with a smile. Well, are you ready? He asked. No, she answered honestly. Kristen, just don't worry, okay? The main thing is that everything goes more or less smoothly with Mom. Everyone else will like you, I'm sure. Andrew muttered and was embarrassed, realizing that he was not saying at all what was needed. And he himself is worried, it seems, even more than Kristen. Kristen and Andrew arrived in the village and, excited, like first graders before their first lesson in their lives, holding hands, they entered the big house. They were really expected, because the spacious living room with huge windows was full of people. Some of them pretended to be doing something, but the majority were not lying. Frankly, and with curiosity, they looked at the chosen one. At first glance, it was clear who exactly was the center of public opinion here. A tall, plump woman of about 50, with a high, carefully styled hairstyle, stood up to meet them. Varnished hair, lips thickly painted with red lipstick, heavy earrings with large red stones, and an equally huge pendant around her neck. A dress made of shiny fabric with an overly bright pattern. All this, of course, was not modern and old-fashioned, but it was, nevertheless, very suitable for this woman. Kristen immediately realized at first sight that this was Andrew's mother, a woman on whom her fate seems to largely depend. Barbara Black was, in every sense of the word, a woman of considerable merit. For many years she worked as the chief accountant of the big vegetable plant, supplying several surrounding cities with fresh vegetables and herbs. The farm was really large and very troublesome, and in order to maintain order in it, one had to have a strong character and determination, great professional knowledge and basic endurance. Barbara possessed all these qualities to the fullest. She always knew about everything that happened at the plant. It doesn't matter what kind of area we were talking about, garages, farming, or the financial service directly subordinate to it. She decisively, and with equal firmness, dealt with negligent employees, unscrupulous suppliers, or late-paying customers. We need Barbara in the government, the workers laughed. Just as decisively and confidently as at work, Barbara handled household chores. How, with such a workload at work, she managed to keep the house and large household plot in perfect order, one could only guess. However, she had no shortage of help, given the large size of her family. Andrew was born third in their family after 2 girls. One of the sisters was already married and expecting a baby, and the second lived with her parents and cursed the garden, which needed care. The mother, as it seemed to her, loved her son more in her soul than the other children. For some reason, the long-awaited boy was especially dear to her. She always dreamed of some special destiny for him, and of course it was hardly possible to find this fate here, in their native, albeit in a fairly large and prosperous village. Therefore, she willingly supported her son when he announced his desire to study and live in the city after school. After working at the plant for many years, Barbara and Ben, as Andrew's father was called, saved enough to buy their son a small but quite decent apartment. Andrew graduated from college, received an engineering degree, and got a job. Barbara's appearance suited her character, tall, with large features, which almost always had an expression of determination and confidence in her rightness. With all her appearance, she seemed to be saying to those around her, so it's like this. Point 1, I'm right. Point 2, if I'm wrong. Look at point 1, Barbara had a rather full and wide figure. But in some amazing way, all this did not give the impression of excess weight. but seemed to be a manifestation of strength, solidity. All that remained was to add to this a loud, well-produced voice, from which the repairmen, taken by surprise, dropped their wrenches on the floor. It was precisely such a remarkable lady in every sense of the word that Kristen was destined to like. And yet this village iron businesswoman had one weak point. She loved her husband Ben very much. And this love was mutual. They have been together for more than 30 years. They have gone through difficulties, illnesses, the birth of children, joys and sorrows. And yet they retained some kind of reverent, tender feeling for each other, more likely to be characteristic of a young boy and girl than of 50-year-old parents of 4 children who have begun to turn gray. Ben worked as a chief mechanic at the same plant. He and his wife were jokingly called the Black Mafia. But at the same time, absolutely everyone recognized that both Barbara and Ben took their places completely deservedly and fairly. Ben has long gotten used to his wife's difficult character. I learned to adapt to him, and if necessary, to tame Barbara's temper. She heard only him when it seemed impossible to reach her. She recognized the unconditional authority of her husband, and although she could not deny herself the pleasure of arguing and defending her point of view, she certainly took her husband's opinion into account. Kristen enjoyed her openly appraising gaze and smiled. The smile turned out pitiful and forced. Hello she didn't say, she rather squeaked. In response, she heard, hello, hello, dear guests. Finally, you brought your mysterious stranger to us. Hello, Kristen. Come in. You're welcome. A short, gray-haired man with kind eyes stepped forward. He was very similar to Andrew. He smiled warmly and welcomingly, and Kristen immediately became much calmer. Oh, Andrew looks like him, Kristen finally realized. So this is his dad. My dear son. Finally, he deigned to come and check on you as Barbara finally opened her lips, decisively pushed her husband away, and, as if not noticing Kristen standing next to her, hugged Andrew. Mom, meet me. This is Kristen, he said when he was finally able to emerge from his mother's strong embrace. That's what I understood, said the woman with the face of a queen. Well, let me look at you. Kristen felt that this look was literally breaking her into molecules. Judging by the expression on her face, Barbara didn't particularly like what she saw. True, there were no comments from her. She just took a deep breath. With the rest of the family, everything went much easier and simpler. For the most part, people were friendly and talked with the girl sincerely and with pleasure. She learned many facts about his childhood and youth, and heard somewhat humorous warnings that Andrew was a womanizer. I got acquainted with photographs where he was a baby, still an infant, and sat without clothes, without anything at all. In general, everything was quite fun and positive, if not for the periodically felt glance of Barbara. Then there was a long, plentiful feast, during which they tried to cram a year's worth of food into Kristen. Oh, how great, suddenly one of the sisters exclaimed, snatching a napkin from under Kristen's hand. Kristen did not notice how he sketched a portrait of one of the aunts sitting opposite on a piece of paper. These are living people. Look. Oh, and you're an artist. And draw me. Please. Kristen spent the rest of the evening drawing pictures of those present and receiving admiring reviews. Finally, the endless day came to an end. But okay, that's enough. Let's finish this gathering. Let's all go home. Tomorrow is a hard day. Get up early and get to work, said Barbara. For what work? Andrew asked in surprise. Tomorrow is Sunday. Wait, I thought we would go to the lake, show Kristen our forest, apiary, and generally take a walk, go to a barbecue. How is it? For what work? What barbecue and lake? The mother looked angrily at her son. As far as I can see, you have become quite a city person. You don't think or remember anything at all. We'll dig potatoes tomorrow, Andrew. Well, Mom, what kind of potatoes? We've come to visit. So what? Now will you order us to die of hunger in the winter because of this? We, son, have our own schedule. We have no time for rest now. No, of course, no one is forcing you. Helping us is up to you. Please go for a walk and eat our kebabs. And we have things to do. The woman, looking offended, rose from the table and left the room. For some reason, Kristen's ears lit up. Of course, we must help. True, I have never dug potatoes, but I think it's not that difficult. I'll handle it. She showed a playful look of fear on her face. Kristen, what do you mean help? There's work there all day. Dad, he turned to his father. But I completely forgot about these damn potatoes. You could have warned me. I wouldn't have brought IRA with me. If I came alone, I would bring her next time. Andrew looked at his father reproachfully. Yes, to be honest, I forgot about this damn harvest. I just don't understand why you're so upset. Well, really, as a child, you don't know your mother, do you? Don't pay attention, Ben waved his hand. Well, of course, don't pay attention. When my mother accused me of parasitism in front of everyone, this meat won't go down my throat now. Kristen is hooked. Well, if so, then go with all of us, work there for an hour, and then take my car and leave from there. The father winked at his son, and at the same time his face suddenly looked younger and became somehow boyish. At this moment, father and son were especially similar to each other. Early in the morning, the whole family in several cars was ready to leave. You are going? Well, that's good, son. Barbara looked at her son with a smile, again pretending not to notice Kristen standing next to her. The girl involuntarily noted this. We really need extra male hands. My father is not going. He was urgently called to the plant. We have a serious breakdown there, but he left you the car and said that you agreed on this. For what? Unclear. Barbara shrugged. Andrew winked at Kristen, put his arm around her shoulders and led her to the car. After a few hours spent in the field, Kristen began to feel as if she had always been here and had never seen anything in her life, and would never see anything again, except brown, yellowish and red tubers. By the second break, everything hurt her neck, back, legs, knees, which endlessly bent and unbent, even her fingers, each joint of which throbbed painfully. But she tried not to show it, and, overcoming the ache in her lower back, courageously carried the buckets, which seemed increasingly heavier. Andrew, why do you need so many potatoes? Kristen asked in a whisper, sadly looking around the huge fields and realizing that he couldn't see the edge or end. Listen, to be honest, I never understood this myself. Please forgive me for these damn potatoes. This is just some kind of setup. Come on, it's okay, she muttered, pouring another portion of the Black family's strategic food supply into the pile. Come on, let's go, Andrew begged her several times. My father left me a car. We'll just leave. Nobody will notice. Nobody will notice. Nobody. Your mother? Kristen asked ironically. Well, Mom, of course, will notice, the guy laughed. Of course he will notice, Kristen thought to herself. She just watches me. Without stopping, sooner or later everything ends. Even what seemed endless. The damn potato field is over. Well, city people, thank you for any help, said Barbara. We could manage, of course. Mom, stop it. Andrew stopped his mother, who seemed to be able to explain to Kristen that no one really needed her help, and it was stupid to expect gratitude from her. Why do you rush to her defense all the time, like a cat to a chicken? Honestly, it's downright funny. Am I some kind of monster? Barbara suddenly became offended. Go help me load the shovels into the car, otherwise we'll forget them on the field again, as always. And Kristen and I will stand here and finally talk about our own things. About women's things. Andrew looked at the women uncertainly, and noticing that Kristen nodded, slowly walked towards the car. Well, okay. Now let's get serious, Barbara said after a very long pause. So long that Kristen managed to calm down, get scared, and come to her senses again. Tell me this, Kristen. Barbara reluctantly said the girl's name. You and my son have a serious relationship. Well, are you planning to marry him? To be honest, Barbara, he didn't ask me to marry. For now, anyway. Kristen decided to be brave and looked directly into the eyes of her opponent. But if he calls, I will consider this offer very seriously. You'll think about it. Are you still going to think? Judging by the indignation, Barbara did not appreciate the irony and was sincerely indignant. Look, she's still getting ready to think. What about you yourself? Such a big jewel? I am not a very profitable party at all. Or rather, completely unprofitable, Kristen tried to joke. But the woman did not take this as playful irony. Vice versa. It's very good that you understand this yourself, and you should always remember it. After all, apparently you have nothing. Housing, for example. Yes, I live with my mother, and unfortunately I don't expect an inheritance from anywhere. But I believe in miracles. You never know. Kristen kept trying to soften Andrew's mother, make her laugh, and remove anger and tension from their communication. But she understood everything wrong. But I immediately realized that you were not very well brought up. You don't have to demonstrate this again. I take it you don't have a profession either. Why not? I actually finished school. I tried to defend myself, Kristen. I have a diploma as an artist teacher, by the way, with honors. Well, what kind of profession is this? Draftsman. Honors. Do not make me laugh. I have a younger niece, and she can draw. Well, maybe a little worse than you. So what? How are you going to make a living? Or are you planning to sit on our necks? I don't dare Kristen to sit on your neck, Barbara. Kristen said quietly. And in general, I would like to tell you. If not for us, then for my son. The woman continued, as if not noticing Kristen's words. That is, Andrew will work for you two and you will draw pictures. Is this how you see your family life? But nothing will work out for you. Don't move. Listen, I won't say it again. If you want to marry my son, get a normal profession. Do you hear? Barbara turned around without warning and quickly walked away. Kristen looked after her silently. Well? Andrew asked with obvious concern. How did you communicate? Yes, we talked. Everyone and my father really liked you. And Mom too. She just told me you have a good girl. Wait and see. Imagine. On the way back, Kristen thought so deeply about everything that had been said that she even stopped feeling pain in her muscles. Or maybe Andrew's mother is right. After all, she is an intelligent, experienced woman. She has achieved everything herself, and she runs such a business. And at home, everything is on track with her. Well, in fact, she, Kristen, cannot feed herself even on her salary. How can she count on a normal family? After all, it turns out that she is some kind of freeloader. Returning to the city, Kristen rushed to find out information about advanced training courses and other ways to obtain additional education. A few days after their return, Andrew spoke with a serious face. Have you thought about studying somewhere else? And I was talking to my mother. She says accountants are needed everywhere now. I don't know how to do it correctly, but in general, you can easily find a job. She even has a friend here in our city. They will hire you without experience. You just need to complete special courses. Kristen looked at Andrew carefully. He understood this look and spoke. Kristen, you understand, Mother won't give us peace anyway. And if you do as she advises, everything will be fine. I didn't tell you my court Kristen as well. Not really my court Kristen. Well, or rather, in fact, of course it's mine, but it's registered to my mother. We have to live there with you. If we decide, Kristen, for my sake. Okay, I'm ready to do anything for you and become anyone, be it a witch or an accountant. I just don't know if I can do it. You see, it will work. He exclaimed confidently. Of course it will work. Everyone can do it. But I'm not everything. I want to do something completely different, I wanted to shout to Kristen, but she remained silent. A few months later, Kristen was working for a large food retail company. She and about 15 other people sat in a huge windowless room, more like a warehouse than an office, and printed an endless document, according to which they then collected and released goods. She now earned almost twice as much as at art school, but there was no talk of any joy or pleasure from work. Kristen felt like a tiny cog in a huge machine, so small and insignificant that even if it falls out, disappears, no one will notice. Kristen, it is you. She heard it once in a big store. Turning around, she saw her old school teacher. He smiled widely. Lord, how glad I am to see you. Well, tell me, how are you doing? Hello. Yes, I live like everyone else. Normally I work. Got married, almost. This is of course wonderful. Congratulations, congratulations. Well, what about creativity, right? I'm still waiting. Maybe you could invite the old man to an exhibition of your works. Drawing is difficult now. Not yet. How so? Are you really not writing at all? It hurts. It's a shame because you have talent. And Kristen, a real talent. Yes, it's a pity. It's a pity. Unfortunately, I still remember your sketches. How so? That's how life turned out. Kristen answered dryly, seeing how the old teacher was lamenting. She, feeling regret, suddenly became offended at him, at herself, at the whole world. She was offended and angry. You see, I need to live on something. It's a pity that the school doesn't teach a course called How Can an Aspiring Artist Avoid Starving to Death? It would be very useful, you know. The old man was taken aback, looked sadly at Kristen and sighed. Well, I was glad to see you. Glad. I wish all the best. He bowed slightly in the old-fashioned manner and walked away. Kristen and Andrew lived in his apartment. A year later, Kristen gave birth to a boy who was named Ted. They never had a wedding. It's just that for some reason neither Kristen nor Andrew talked about it. And then there was no time for that at all. At 2 years old, the baby was diagnosed with heart failure. Kristen's whole life was completely devoted to her son, just as her mother's life had once been dedicated to her. But only if Mom was completely alone, then her beloved man lived in the same apartment with Kristen. At first, despite Ted's illness, she was happy. In any case, she herself was convinced of this. Andrew was caring and gentle. He tried to be at home more often and play with his son. But gradually, at first almost imperceptibly, in some isolated tiny moments, and then more and more often and clearly, something began to happen that meant the end of their family happiness. Andrew began to sometimes delay returning home, at first occasionally and not for long, but gradually more and more often. Kristen, hello. Listen, there's a lot of work. Don't lose me. Okay, she heard it periodically on the telephone receiver. Then came car breakdowns with visits to the workshop, meeting a friend from the plane, a dentist, urgent trips to see his parents. Kristen and Ted were increasingly alone. Andrew gradually became completely different. A wall grew inexorably between him and Kristen. Kristen was afraid to admit this to herself and stubbornly continued to convince herself that everything in her life was good, and that there were minor problems and troubles in every family. At the same time at work, year after year, she did what she did not like and did not understand. The computer and the numbers in the documents gave me headaches and eyes, and the boredom that overwhelmed her in the office was sometimes unbearable. All the old albums, folders with sketches and sketches, once unfinished canvas paintings, everything that was once so dear to her, was her joy, her essence, was collecting dust in her mother's old closed apartment. Anne herself passed away 2 years ago, just as quietly and unnoticed by others as she lived. And the sadness for my mother was also quiet, muted light. Kristen sometimes came to the small apartment, which now became her apartment. She looked through her works, and she had the feeling that she was looking at her past, covered in dust, but still beautiful. And I didn't want to return to the present at all. In the present, she lived some kind of life that was not her own, an incomprehensible, uninteresting, unnecessary life. Relations with my friend Helen were essentially reduced to telephone conversations, which became less and less frequent. Helen, in her usual straightforward manner, scolded Kristen that she was doing something she didn't like and had completely given up drawing, locked herself at home, and saw nothing but a completely idiotic job, as a friend put it. You live as if under a stick, but look at yourself, you look like, I don't know, a young old woman. Ted, meanwhile, turned 5 years old. Andrew sometimes spent the evenings at home, but they hardly spoke. He sat at the computer or spent time on the loggia with a mobile phone in his hand. Kristen began to involuntarily notice that when she appeared, he tried to minimize the screen on the monitor or turn off the device, or end the conversation. Andrew's phone, which was usually lying around wherever possible, always forgotten by its owner in the most unexpected places, was now always either in his hands or in his pocket. Kristen wandered around the apartment like a ghost, studied with Ted, put him to bed, and went to bed herself. Then she lay for a long time, listening to Andrew settling down for the night in the next room. We need to talk. She finally decided to break the unbearable silence at home. Tell me honestly, do you have someone? He looked at Kristen. Actually, she no longer needed an answer spoken out loud. What happened to us? She asked Andrew. After all, once upon a time, everything was so good with us. You loved me, I loved you. Life was wonderful. What has changed? Why have we changed so much? You are the one who has changed, and I'm no longer interested in you. And then, let's be honest, I never told you that I love you. Did I like you? Yes, very. You were so unusual, not like everyone else, different in everything. And then she turned into some kind of gray mouse. But it's you. You forced me to become different, forced me to change, to leave everything I loved, quit my favorite thing. You. You know, my mother warned me that you would blame us for everything. And so it happened. What did you leave there? What's the matter? You'd think you could be a great artist. Nothing would have come of you anyway. Well, at most I would draw pictures for advertising signs. Kristen closed her eyes tiredly. How right Helen was when she said that she, Kristen, sold herself. And now she is paying for this betrayal. If you expect to get something from me, you are in vain. We are not registered, and you have no rights to my property. Of course you will move out of the apartment. Ted. Kristen looked at the man in panic. He saw this look, and something similar to shame flashed in his eyes. Ted, of course, will live with you. Andrew said embarrassedly. I'm not a bastard to take Kristen away from the child's mother. He seemed to have recovered from his momentary weakness, cast aside his conscience, and continued. And about alimony, keep in mind that I don't officially work. There's nothing special to take from me. If you try to sue me. Andrew, tell me honestly, Kristen, sitting comfortably on a kitchen stool, put her hands on the table and rested her chin on her fists. Did your mother write the words for this speech? What other words? What does this have to do with Mom? He was nervous. Her behavior infuriated him. She didn't make a fuss, didn't cry, didn't beg him for anything. She simply looked at him with her attentive gaze, as if noticing all the details for the future portrait. These are not your thoughts. You can't be that scoundrel. I don't believe. But don't be afraid. In any case, I don't need anything from you. Kristen said, looking at Andrew with sad regret. Everything I need is already with me. What is this? He became wary. What do you mean? Ted, Kristen said calmly. And myself, the real one. The former one, I forgot, Kristen, you. It's just something you don't need. Kristen took Ted's things and went to her old apartment. A few days later, she realized that there was no trace left of her loneliness. She was herself again, the mistress of her life, and paintings and drawings like old friends supported her. With the new job, everything happened completely by accident. Lena, with whom Kristen again communicated, as in the old days, often easily and directly, without choosing Kristen, I had the time and mood, giving themselves to each other and not expecting anything in return, as true friends should communicate, had a birthday. Helen, my dear, happy birthday. Kristen hugged her friend and entered the large living room. She's been here many times. She liked the spacious, bright room with a minimal amount of furniture and a huge shaggy carpet in the center. But today something was wrong. Something was terribly in the way, creating severe discomfort. Kristen looked carefully at the living room and realized exactly what it was: a huge, bright, but surprisingly tasteless flower bouquet standing on the table. It was composed of chic, unusual flowers and greenery, but it gave the impression of some kind of expensive bad taste. Kristen tried not to pay attention to him, but her artistic taste violently protested. No, I'm sorry, but I can't do this, Helen. It's terrible. Where did you get this terrible bouquet? There is no composition, the colors simply oppress each other. Can I correct it a little? This here is completely unnecessary. That's better, right? Well, wait a minute. Helen suddenly stared at her friend. Exactly, I came up with it. This is brilliant, what you need. Listen, I have a client. We are working on a contract with her. FIFA, you know, is all about itself. By the way, she gave me this bouquet. She has several flower shops with a pretense of sophistication. The prices for flowers there are simply terrible. When I looked at one of her contracts with suppliers, I thought that, judging by the figures, she was selling imported medicines. Well, you know, these flowers have a name that will break your tongue. So she complained that she did not have decent bouquet makers. Like them, Helen recalled the right word with a snap of her fingers: florists. Well, what do I have to do with it? Kristen shrugged. I'm not a florist. But you are an artist. Who, if not you, should know what is beautiful and what is not? Exactly. I'll talk to her, we'll send you to courses and start working. You know, Helen, I've had enough courses. I tried to resist Kristen, but Helen, who had gained momentum, was not easy to stop. The new case has taken over Kristen completely. Finally, she again plunged into the beauty of paint, the form of her imagination. Each flower was a separate work of art for her, and those collected together were her personal works. It was as if she was painting human feelings and emotions with colors. She wrote with inspiration, boldly telling stories of love, gratitude, tenderness, and determination with each bouquet. Of course, she, or rather her composition, has regular customers and fans. People sometimes just came to look, admire, and feel the harmony. You know, Kristen, it looks like we need to make a personal showcase for your work, the business owner remarked, smiling. Among her regular clients, Kristen soon began to single out one who periodically went to the flower salon. He was a rather tall, thin man with a small gray beard and hair. He wore thin glasses with gold frames, and all this made his face somehow not modern, as if from the last century. Interesting person. Kristen quietly pointed at him with her eyes to her partner. Someone not from here. as if he appeared from the last century. It will stand for a short time and disappear again. It won't disappear. A girl named Alice answered ironically. He lives quite well in the present. Be calm. Don't you know who it is? Wow, this is George. Well, the same one who runs the car plant. They say he can buy and sell our entire city. He visited us regularly. He has an office nearby, that huge building on the corner. A strange man, he will stand at the display window and stand there, sigh and smile. Maybe he's sick? Well, the rich have their own quirks. Alice was clearly not against continuing the conversation about the visitor, who was interesting in every sense. But Kristen could not stand gossip, and nodding to Alice, stepped aside. Tell me, please. Kristen heard a quiet voice, sounding clear but soft. This is what people say who don't need to be listened to, because everyone already shuts up when they want to say something. Can I talk to the person who compiled them? Yes, please. It's me. Kristen smiled lightly and looked into his eyes. Do you want to buy them? No, I mean yes, or rather he adjusted his glasses. Actually, I would like something like that. No, these are also beautiful, but for me they are too bright, you know. I would like something, how to put it. He fell silent, looking for the right word. Calm down, apparently she suggested. Yes, it's definitely calmer, exactly, the man rejoiced. A very precise word. How did you pick it up? It's not me. This is the theory of artistic art, well-known terminology, answered by Kristen. So you need a calm, warm monochrome? For whom? Can you provide some details? For a woman 56 years old. 3 grandchildren, financier, blonde. He encouraged Kristen's words, taking short pauses between them, and smiled, as if appreciating a new interesting game. Well, I'll try. Kristen smiled in response. This is simply amazing. Each of your bouquets is like, I don't know, like a canvas, a painting. Yes, that's exactly the picture. The man looked admiringly at the bouquet compiled before his eyes. You're just an artist, Kristen, he added, looking at her badge. I'm glad you like it, she said with a slight bow. Like very much. I'm sure the recipient will be absolutely delighted. Thank you, maestro. He carefully took the large bouquet and walked towards the exit of the salon. He came into the salon quite often. Too often for a man and a businessman. This was quite unusual. One day, while selling him the 3rd bouquet in a week, Kristen looked up at him with a smile. You buy flowers so often. She decided to notice. You obviously have many reasons for this. Do you really need a reason to give flowers? I just like to give flowers, he replied. With or without reason. You know, it's like taking colored pencils and coloring a gray sheet. Kristen looked at the man suspiciously, trying to determine if he was mocking her. He uttered very unusual, strange words for a man, especially one who was considered one of the unofficial masters of the city. Flowers are beautiful, and there should be many of them in life. It's true? That's what everyone thinks, don't they? But many people probably think so. But to put these thoughts into practice, frankly speaking, you are the first person on my path who does this. Kristen laughed. Besides, he continued, your salon is very conveniently located between the house where I live and my office building, so we can assume that I come to you on the way home or to work. Well, the last argument is why I began to come here much more often than before. He looked carefully at Kristen. I assume you know it's your work and you. The last words were added very quietly. Kristen flushed, lowered her head and pretended she hadn't heard, depicting extreme busyness. You know, Kristen, your works still have one big drawback. Kristen raised her head in surprise. Yes, yes. And this flaw migrates from one of your jobs to another. They are all beautiful, but short-lived, alas. And sometimes I want your bouquet to stay with me forever. This one, for example. Do you want me to do it? Would you like me to draw it for you? Suddenly suggested Kristen, who suddenly wanted to pick up brushes and paints until her fingers trembled and she cried. 3 years have passed. On a wonderful May morning, Kristen got up very early and still realized with fear that she was unlikely to have time to do everything that was planned. Today is the day of a grand event that she has dreamed of all her life. Just yesterday she was pleased with how everything was organized, but in the morning she suddenly realized with horror that she needed to change the position of the paintings and put on additional light. On the contrary, several huge windows need to be covered. You definitely need to remove the last 2 pictures. Still, it was not for nothing that she felt that they were not ready yet. Everything had to be perfect. And for this, a lot more needed to be done. It was necessary to call a dozen places, coordinate a huge number of little things, which as usual, came out at the last moment. Despite the fact that today's entire event had been carefully planned and prepared for a long time, it was organized by the best specialists, and yet, it was her business, her life. And only she knew how everything should really be. Today, a personal exhibition Kristen opened at the Central Art Gallery of the city. As experts wrote about her, she is one of the most talented and promising artists of recent times. Well, are you ready for world fame? A huge bouquet of wet, half-bloomed peonies, probably consisting of at least 100 flowers, cautiously entered the room. The bouquet had man's legs. The immense bunch of flowers moved slightly, and from behind it appeared a thin face with a beard and glasses with thin gold frames sitting on his nose. "No, I'm not ready," Kristen laughed, feeling her anxiety, worry, and excitement disappear like smoke. She came up and hugged the bouquet, which the man continued to hold in his hands on the other side. Then she moved the delicate, subtly fresh-smelling buds and kissed the cheek that appeared. "Kristen," he whispered, "I love you and am very proud of you." "I love you very much too, George. Thanks for all." A few hours later, Kristen, in a stunning dress, accepted congratulations on the resounding success of her exhibition. A little to the side, squinting in pleasure in the bright light, stood George, her husband, the man thanks to whom her dream became possible. The man who loved her for who she was. After an endless reception, the couple finally got ready to go home and got into the car. "Kristen," she suddenly heard. A man in a driver's uniform stood a little to the side. He had a baseball cap on his head. The face was in shadow, but in the figure, in the pose, in the manner of holding her right hand a little back, Kristen felt something very familiar. She looked closely, and a light, sad, barely noticeable smile touched her lips. "Wait a minute. Okay?" she said in the direction of George, who was already sitting in the car behind the wheel, and moved towards the one who was standing. "Andrew," she didn't ask, she said affirmatively. "Hello." "Hello," he answered hoarsely. "I hardly recognized you, but I still recognized you. Well, congratulations. So you achieved your goal, you became queen." He grinned wryly and said, "Andrew." "No, I just became myself," Kristen smiled.
Lucinda struggled to open her eyes. Her whole body ached. The IV wires were sticking out of her arm, and her mouth tasted of blood, and she was terribly thirsty. Every movement was difficult. The woman tried to remember the previous events. Here she and her husband were driving home from the anniversary of his business partner. He sat behind the wheel himself, although he drank a lot at the party. At first, everything was fine. They were almost home. Then Lucinda remembered the headlights shining in her face, and then the impact. Someone had called the paramedics. It felt like the ambulance had come pretty quickly. It loaded her into the car, and what happened next the woman did not know, because after loading into the ambulance she lost consciousness and woke up only now. A nurse entered the room and asked how the patient was feeling. "What about my husband?" Lucinda wheezed. "He's fine. He's not hurt. As far as I know, he's being questioned by the police." "Why?" "He swerved into oncoming traffic and his blood alcohol was tested. The car you collided with was unlucky. The impact threw it several meters to the side. The man behind the wheel is badly hurt and there's little chance of him surviving." "What's going to happen to my husband now?" "I don't know," the nurse shrugged indifferently. "Most likely he will be taken to the station as there is no threat to his life." Lucinda was very frightened. It seemed to her that the nurse spoke to her with a kind of contempt, and she was not mistaken. Her husband's fault was likely to kill an innocent man, and her husband had not even scratched himself in the accident. Lucinda had asked him not to drive. She'd asked him to call a cab, but he hadn't agreed, and this is the result. Maybe it was for the best, Lucinda thought as she drifted off to sleep. Lucinda had met her husband about 5 years ago. She'd been working late that night. She had no money for a cab, so she decided to go to the bus stop and wait for the bus, which now ran at least half an hour apart. It was raining heavily outside, and Lucinda didn't have an umbrella with her. As she approached the bus stop, she noticed that the bus had just pulled away from her. "What bad luck," Lucinda muttered to herself. Now I'll have to stand here for another half an hour getting wet. However, in 5 minutes, an expensive foreign car stopped right in front of Lucinda. The window on the passenger side opened and a pleasant male voice said, "Young lady, do you need a ride?" No, Lucinda answered fearfully. "I'm waiting for the bus. Thank you." "Don't be afraid. I won't eat you." "Why don't you say something?" Liam asked in the same voice. "Answer me." "I understand you," Lucinda whispered. "Can I go now?" Liam slowly approached his wife and offered his hand. Lucinda stood up from the chair, whereupon the man pulled her tightly against him. The woman's heart was beating at breakneck speed. "Don't be afraid," Liam said as gently as possible. "I love you very much, but I won't let you play with yourself. You're mine and mine alone. Don't make me remind you of that again." The man released his wife from his embrace and said, "And now you can go. I still have work to do. Go to bed. I'll join you a little later." Lucinda, without saying a word, left the office and went up to the bedroom. How to go on living after all that she had heard, the woman had no idea at all. Since then, Lucinda's attitude toward her husband had changed a lot. She kept remembering his words and threats. Liam, on the contrary, behaved as if nothing had happened. He spoiled his wife with gifts, took her to luxurious restaurants, gave her huge bouquets of flowers every day. Lucinda, completely confused, she did not know how to respond to all this now. After all, she is not a toy, but a living person. She cannot be treated like this. But she couldn't leave Liam yet. After all, the woman hadn't worked anywhere for months. Though she still had her premarital apartment, Lucinda had nothing else and could hardly find a good job quickly. And Liam would probably do his best to make sure no one would take her in. The woman would be left completely destitute. Therefore, Lucinda saw two ways out of the situation: to wait until Liam himself lost interest in her, or to accumulate a safety cushion, choose the right moment and divorce her husband. Deciding that both options took time, she began to save money in secret from Liam. It certainly wouldn't go to waste, Lucinda thought. Time passed, but Liam didn't even think about leaving Lucinda. He loved her, led in his own way, with jealousy, constant control, but he still loved her. However, the man was having business problems. Competitors decided to buy out his firm on very unfavorable terms for him. And in case of refusal, promised problems with suppliers and customers, which gradually and carried out. Liam had already lost 2 major clients, which could not but affect his income. He even had to fire some employees, including his driver, to save at least some money. But he was not going to give up his lifestyle completely. Lucinda decided that this situation could play to her advantage. But on the other hand, she could not leave her husband in such a difficult period of life. Liam, wanting to find a way out of this unpleasant situation, began to look for new connections, those who could help him. He managed to interest one influential man in the city, who later became his partner. Things began to slowly get better. Liam found a new client thanks to his partner, for which he was very grateful. One day, Liam received an invitation to the anniversary of his new partner. There were no reasons for refusal, and the man together with Lucinda went to the party. His driver Liam fired, even when there were financial difficulties, and a new one was never hired. Therefore, the man himself sat behind the wheel of his car. The holiday was held at the highest level. Liam managed to meet new useful people. The same could not be said for Lucinda. She was bored among these people, so she pretended to be sick and asked Liam to let her go home in a cab. But he decided to drive his wife home on his own, especially since he'd already made all the necessary acquaintances. Lucinda asked him not to get behind the wheel after so much alcohol, but the man did not listen to his wife, saying that he is no longer a boy and can make such decisions himself. In the end, all this led to the fact that Lucinda ended up with injuries in the hospital. In the next room, on the verge of life and death, lay a guy who drove into her husband, and Liam himself was questioned by the police. Lucinda woke up the next morning. A familiar nurse was fussing over her bed, doing something with her IV. When she noticed Lucinda was awake, she turned to her. "How are you feeling?" she asked in an indifferent voice. "I don't know," Lucinda replied. "Probably like any other person after an accident. The police want to talk to you. Will you be able to do that now?" "Yes, of course," Lucinda said confusedly. The nurse headed for the exit, but the woman stopped her. Wait a minute. How's the guy my husband and I crashed into feeling? I didn't think you'd be interested in that. Although you probably just want to know what kind of punishment to expect for your husband. He survived tonight, which is a good sign. His chances of living have improved considerably, although the consequences could be very unpleasant. His spine is damaged, and it's likely he'll never walk again. What a nightmare, Lucinda whispered. The nurse grinned wickedly and left the room. A few minutes later, a man in a police uniform came to Lucinda's room. Lucinda, he said. Yes, that's me. My name is Jacob. I want to ask you some questions about yesterday's incident. Do you mind? Of course, I'll answer all your questions. Thank you. We spoke to your husband yesterday, but for the sake of completeness, we need to hear your side of the story. Do you remember exactly how the collision occurred? Yeah, we were driving home from the suburbs. At some point, Liam jerked the car to the left, and we were apparently in the oncoming lane. Then the impact happened. That's all I can tell you. Tell me, do you have a driver's license? Do you know how to drive? No. Why do you ask? They're just standard questions, the cop lied. In fact, he needed to understand what Liam had said was true and what was fiction. Her husband had tried to set her up by saying that she had been driving that night, that a car had driven into them and she had been trying to avoid a collision. But one thing he hadn't considered was that the police would be questioning his wife so soon. Liam thought he'd have time to tell her what to say and how to say it so no one would get in trouble. And what would happen to the injured guy, Liam didn't care at all. Lucinda, did your husband ever drink and drive? No, it was a one-time thing. He used to always have a driver, but now he had to sack him because of financial difficulties, so Liam drove himself. Thank you, Lucinda, for your answers. You've been very helpful. Tell me, Jacob, what's the threat to my husband? It depends on how the other party to the accident feels. But in any case, your husband will not be able to avoid criminal punishment because it was his fault that serious harm to health was caused. You can only use the services of a good lawyer. Perhaps he will help to reduce the term of punishment, although it is unlikely that he will succeed. Why? Because the victim is the son of a deputy from a neighboring region. I think you understand that his father will do everything he can to maximize the punishment for the perpetrator. I understand. Thank you, Lucinda replied quietly. The policeman left the room. There was no doubt in his mind now that Liam had been driving the car. What a vile man. How can you shift your guilt onto another person, especially a woman? Jacob quietly scolded his own wife. In his many years of service, he had never gotten used to human meanness and betrayal. Now he was ready to fight to make sure the man got what he deserved. The policeman dialed the number of his employee and told him to take Liam into custody, because yesterday, based on his testimony, the man was released on his own recognizance. Now he wouldn't be able to get out of this story so easily. Liam was working on his main problem when the doorbell rang. Who the hell is that? The man cursed. There was a police officer standing on the doorstep. Liam? Well, he replied dismissively. You need to come with us to the station. You're suspected of committing a road traffic accident causing grievous bodily harm to a third party. Why would I do that? I already told your superiors yesterday how it was. All questions to my wife, who was driving, but she's in no condition to answer your questions. We're the injured party. We were hit by a crazy guy in a six. Ask him. We've already taken your wife's statement, and that, as you put it, crazy man now lies in intensive care, and it is not known whether he will live. And his father is unlikely to let you get away with it. Wait, Liam was indignant. When did my wife have time to talk to you? She's in the hospital and hasn't come to her senses yet, as far as I know. You're wrong. She's perfectly capable of talking and testifying. So you better watch your words, otherwise your situation may be aggravated by perjury. Bitch. Liam swore irritably. Liam, let's not do this, politely asked one of the arresting police officers. Don't you tell me what to do. Okay, that's insulting an officer in the line of duty. Guys, let's cuff him and let's go. Liam tried to resist, but it was stupid, given his position and the strength of the police. Half an hour later, he was already being questioned by an investigator who informed him of his wife's statement and hinted at who the injured guy was. So the best thing the man could do now was to tell the truth and cooperate with the investigation. Liam had no choice but to comply, but he demanded a lawyer, refusing to speak without one. Thus began the investigation and trial. Meanwhile, Lucinda was on the mend. She was already able to walk around the hospital on her own. However, it was strange to her that her husband had not yet given any news about himself. The woman decided that he was just minding his own business, and now he was no longer interested in her. Lucinda was far from how cases were investigated, so she did not even suggest that Liam could be in the detention center. One day she was walking down the corridor of the hospital and saw a young man being moved into one of the wards, followed by the policeman who had come to see her. Lucinda immediately realized that this was the victim Liam had driven his car into. Curiosity got the better of the woman, and she cautiously approached the room to overhear the conversation. "Kevin, the man responsible for the accident has been apprehended," said a voice that sounded familiar to Lucinda. "Your father will be here soon. He's already been informed that you've recovered." "Shit, that's the last thing I need is my father here. How am I going to explain all this to him?" "Kevin, you didn't have to do this. Steal someone else's car, get behind the wheel without a license, and go nowhere? Because my dad was a real pain in the ass. I wanted to get away from him, do something on my own." Kevin, you're gonna be handicapped for the rest of your life. Do you realize that?" Suddenly, Lucinda got a call from behind. "What are you doing here?" It was the nurse who was taking care of Lucinda. "You don't belong here. Or are you trying to bribe the victim? You're getting ready." "What are you talking about?" The woman was indignant. "Why should I bribe him? I'm only interested in his condition. You're all the same. Damn rich people. First you make a mess of things, and then you hide and think about who would bring money to whitewash yourselves. The guy's lucky to be alive, by the way. He'll probably be in a wheelchair from now on, and you and your husband will go on living in peace, knowing no troubles." Lucinda silently looked at the nurse with surprised eyes. Now she understood why she had been so rude to her all this time. "Look, I don't want to bribe anyone, and I don't have the money myself, and I don't know what my husband's plans are. He hasn't even come to see me once in all this time. Maybe he's out of town." Jacob came out of the victim's room. "What's going on here?" he asked angrily. "Oh, it's you, Lucinda. I've been meaning to talk to you. Can we go to your room?" "Of course," Lucinda answered quietly. When they entered, the policeman closed the door behind him and told Lucinda about her husband's affairs. "The investigation has already proved his guilt. The case has been submitted to the court, and the hearing will take place next week. Liam has no chance of staying free, and the victim's father will do his best to make sure he gets as much time as possible." As it turned out, Liam drove into the car of an 18-year-old boy who stole or simply arranged to borrow a car from an acquaintance to escape from his parents. His father doesn't have that much influence in this town, but nevertheless he has just as much money as Liam. Tears rolled down Lucinda's cheeks. She felt sorry for the injured boy. She was scared for Liam, even though she didn't love him anymore. He wasn't a stranger to her, and she was worried about him. And most importantly, it was not clear what she should do now, how to live with this burden. Lucinda woke up from an incomprehensible rumble. When she opened her eyes, she saw an unfamiliar man in an expensive suit and a robe thrown over his shoulders. "You're asleep, bitch. You murdered my son, and now you're just lying there. I'll make your life a living hell. You and your husband will go to hard labor for the rest of your life. Who are you and what do you want?" Lucinda asked fearfully, though she had already guessed who her visitor was. "I am your nightmare from now on and for the rest of your life." Lucinda sat up on the bed, sleep finally receded. She looked at the man carefully. "Stop screaming. I can understand your condition and sincerely sympathize with you. But this grief does not give you any right to behave like this with a stranger, especially without knowing all the details of what happened. You talk to me here. I'm not going to leave you like this. I said it all." After that, the man turned around and left the room, slamming the door loudly. Lucinda remained sitting motionless. She could not even imagine what to expect from this man. After sitting like that for about half an hour, the woman decided to go check on Kevin, the guy who had been injured in the accident. She approached his room and knocked gently. No one answered. Then Lucinda opened the door. "May I come in?" the woman asked. There was still no answer. Then the woman entered the room. Kevin was lying on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. "Hi," Lucinda said. "Hello." "Who the hell are you?" Kevin asked back. "My name is Lucinda. I was a passenger in the car that hit you." "Oh, what did you want? Is this about my father? You think I sicked him on you? Well, you're wrong. I don't blame you for anything. Neither you nor your husband. It's my own fault. I shouldn't have started all this. I'd be at home now, warm, cozy, fed, and happy. No, I wanted my freedom. I'm really sorry about what happened. I know it sounds stupid, and it won't make things right, but I'm sorry." Kevin looked at Lucinda in surprise. "Forgive you for what? It's not like you had anything to do with it. You were a passenger, and I was hit by the driver, your husband, I understand." "Yes, my husband. Only he's never gonna admit he's to blame in his life. He'll blame everyone around him but him, and I don't think he cares about anyone else but himself. Maybe now he'll realize something." "You say that like you're glad he's in trouble." It was hard for Lucinda to admit it, but she did feel a certain amount of joy that Liam might get a real sentence. "Maybe you're right," Lucinda sighed. "That way I'd have at least a chance to get away and divorce him. Wasn't there any way to do it without that?" "Apparently not," the woman replied sadly. "He's terribly possessive. Next to him I felt like a prisoner and I could not leave. He promised me such problems, no worse than your father. So my sacrifice wasn't in vain." Kevin tried to smile. "Did my father threaten you?" "Yeah, it came by today. Yelling, cursing. Never mind. I didn't come to you to complain or ask you to save me from him. I'm an adult. I have to deal with my own problems. I'm sorry again. I'm really sorry about what happened. You're a good person." "Thanks, Kevin. Where were you going in such a hurry? Would you mind telling me?" "I'll tell you. I wanted to start my own life. I guess, like you, I wanted to be free of my parents' custody. I was tired of being pushed around. Constant control. My father was always forcing me to study. He paid for me to go to law school. That's not my thing. I wanted to study music. I even had a band with some guys, but my parents made me give it all up, saying I wouldn't get anywhere with my music. So I decided to run away. I saved up some money, borrowed a friend's car, got in and drove off." Lucinda couldn't hold back her tears. She felt so sorry for this guy, who had such grandiose dreams, such a will to achieve them, determination. And now, because of her husband, he lost everything. Now Kevin's whole life is about lying in bed. He's unlikely to have a wife and children. He won't be able to play his favorite guitar anymore. He's not even going to be the lawyer his parents wanted him to be. "Lucinda, don't cry. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just what someone upstairs wanted. And I'll talk to your father. I promise you, he won't hurt you." "Thank you, Kevin," Lucinda said gratefully. She went back to her room. The woman felt a little better. The next few days were completely uneventful. She socialized with Kevin. The guy turned out to be a very developed and interesting conversationalist. Lucinda was surprised that in her 32 years, she could so easily and freely communicate with an 18-year-old guy. Kevin's father didn't show up again. He was too busy with Liam's lawsuit. Meanwhile, Lucinda was getting ready to be discharged with a lot of important things ahead of her. Lucinda couldn't leave the hospital without saying goodbye to Kevin. The evening before the day of discharge, she went to his room as usual. They talked a lot about life, their families, their dreams. "Kevin, what happened to your mom? Why did your dad come to see you alone and I never saw her?" "I don't have a mom," the kid simply answered. "What do you mean?" Lucinda was surprised. "It's like this. When I was 5 years old, she left my father for some richer man 20 years older than her. She hasn't even been interested in me or my life since." Dad, of course, didn't grieve about it for long. To everyone's misfortune, in 6 months he brought into the house a young long-legged blonde and soon married her. Naturally, she doesn't want my father or me. She's interested in Daddy's money and connections, but apparently he's fine with that. That's why she's been living with us all these years. I can't say we have a warm relationship. It's more like neighbors. "What a hard fate you've had," Lucinda said sympathetically. "It's okay. I'd accepted it. I guess it's more interesting than living on my own. At least I've seen something in my short life." "Don't say that. You've got so much more to see." "What's there to see when you're lying in bed?" "Kevin, I mean, we can try to do something. There are cases where people have recovered from injuries like this. And your father's got money. I think he'll spare no expense in your recovery. Lucinda, do you believe that? I do. The woman answered firmly. You believe it? Okay, thank you. Kevin, I actually came to tell you that I'm being discharged tomorrow, and I won't be seeing you here anymore, and I don't know if I'll ever see you again. I want to get away from all of this. Divorce Liam, sell the apartment, buy a train ticket, and go somewhere where no one will find me. But I'm sorry to leave you. I've grown so attached to you these days. You're a very nice guy, really. But your father won't approve of us hanging out. I'll leave you my number anyway. If you want, you can call me any time of the day or night. I'll always be ready to listen to you. I'm sorry to break up with you too, Kevin replied quietly, as if embarrassed. If we had met under different circumstances, I would definitely have asked you to go out with me. Kevin lowered his eyes in embarrassment. He couldn't tell Lucinda directly how he felt for fear of being rejected. But during these days that they had known each other, the guy had fallen in love with her up to his ears. Kevin, what are you talking about, and what does that have to do with anything? I'm 14 years older than you. We'd make a great couple. You're very nice, and you're bound to meet a girl worthy of you and age appropriate. Why would you want a grown-up aunt with a lot of problems and a bad marriage? Lucinda tried to joke. You're not an aunt. Kevin was indignant. I'm going to go. It's getting late. Call me. Lucinda went back to her room. She lay down on the bed and thought about the words Kevin had said to her. She was worried that this nice guy was so attached to her and harbored false feelings. Lucinda realized the absurdity of the situation. Okay, the woman said aloud, I'll leave. He'll forget me and everything will be fine. His father is a rich man with connections. He'll probably be able to help his son get back on his feet and everything will be fine. The next day, Lucinda checked out and went home. The first thing she needed to do was to find out how Liam was doing, but how to do that the woman didn't understand yet. She didn't have the contacts of the policemen who had come to see her, and she didn't know who else to call. Lucinda finally found the number of their district police officer on the internet, and after an hour of negotiating and calling various authorities, she was given the number of Jacob, who was handling the case. She dialed the number and heard a familiar voice. Senior Lieutenant, speaking. Hello, my name is Lucinda. You were in charge of my husband Liam's case. Yes, I understand what you wanted. I wanted to know how he was doing, how the trial ended. Maybe I'm in the wrong place, but I don't know who I can get information from. But he's my husband. I want to know how he's doing. He was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison with a fine. He was lucky that the victim survived and his father could not seriously influence the court's decision. If you want to meet him, come to the detention center. Jacob gave Lucinda the address and said goodbye. The woman wondered whether she should see her husband after all that had happened or whether she should run away. Lucinda was confused. On the one hand, she realized that the best thing to do was to run away now without saying anything to Liam. On the other hand, she felt sorry for her husband because they were close to him and had a family life, albeit not a long one. In the end, the woman decided that she should meet with Liam, if only to inform him of the divorce. Maybe the situation had taught him something, Lucinda reasoned. Maybe he'd learned that you can't be so stubborn and selfish. That there's a chance for reconciliation in this family. Everyone deserves a second chance. With these thoughts, Lucinda changed her clothes, cleaned herself up, and went to the address. Once there, the woman saw a gray, gloomy building with bars on the windows behind a high fence with barbed wire. At the gate stood 2 sentries. Lucinda walked past them, feeling an inexplicable fear and panic inspired by the place. At the entrance, she was met by the officer on duty. Hello, who are you here to see? He asked. Good afternoon. I was told I could meet my husband. He was recently convicted and brought to you. Your husband's name and surname, and your identification, please. Liam, Lucinda replied, holding out her passport to the officer on duty. Have a seat. I'll find out everything now. The officer on duty called someone on the phone, asked something, and after a couple of minutes he turned to Lucinda. Follow me. He led the woman into a special room for dating. There was a table and 2 chairs opposite each other. Have a seat. Your husband will be right with you. Lucinda sat down on one of the chairs. She noticed at once that it was terribly uncomfortable, apparently on purpose, so that people did not stay here for long. 5 minutes later, Liam entered the room. He looked wrinkled, his face covered in stubble, his hair disheveled, and there were bruises under his eyes, indicating that he'd had a lot of sleep. "Hi," Lucinda said quietly. "How are you?" "Don't you see?" Liam replied with a grin. "I'm resting here like a sanatorium." "Liam, don't be sarcastic. I don't want to hurt you." "Yeah?" The man shouted indignantly. "And who told the cops that it was me who drove and hit that puppy and drunk? Wasn't it you, dear wife? What did I say wrong?" Lucinda was surprised. "They came and asked me how it was, so I told them." "Then you think with your empty head that you should have asked me first what you could and couldn't say. I should have told them you were driving. We both be home right now, and we both be out of trouble. And you ratted me out, you bitch." "Liam, stop it. How dare you accuse me of something? I didn't put you behind the wheel like that. That poor guy was lucky to be alive. You ruined his life. I don't care about that guy. I care about my own life. And it's going downhill right now. So you listen to me. You're gonna go home now. Find Jason's phone number in my address book. Call him and describe the situation. Then you're gonna do whatever he says to get me out of here. You got it? Why didn't you call him yourself?" "I didn't have time. I didn't think it would happen so fast. Do you understand what you have to do? I'm asking you." "I'm not helping you, Liam. I don't know how I ever married such a monster. You don't see anyone but yourself. You don't need anyone. I'm filing for divorce and you can't stop me. Just try it. I'll pull you out of the ground. You'll owe me for the rest of your life for all the money I spent on you. And also," Liam didn't get a chance to finish because a policeman came into the room. "Your date is over. Citizen out. You get up. Let's go back to your cell." "You know what I mean," Liam growled angrily. Lucinda quickly grabbed her bag and ran out of the building. She regretted that she had even decided to go to this meeting with her husband. What a tyrant he'd been. He was still a tyrant. Maybe even worse. Lucinda walked slowly toward the bus stop, thinking about what to do next. Lucinda's first order of business was to file for divorce from Liam. Now she had no doubt that this man would never change and living next to him would be hell. Lucinda didn't want to stay in his house either, so after packing her things and accumulated money, the woman left here for good, returning to her premarital apartment. Lucinda decided that the most correct course of action would be to file for divorce through the courts. She filed a statement of claim and waited for the result. She was immediately warned that such cases usually take 1 to 3 months. After that, Lucinda began to look for a buyer for her apartment. The woman wanted to get rid of everything that kept her here, in this city, to escape once and for all. So she asked the minimum price for her place, just to sell it faster. She was lucky. A young man named John was looking for a suitable apartment in the neighborhood to start a family. He was completely satisfied with Lucinda's price offer, and the apartment itself was a great option. All that was left was to wait for a reply from the bank, which had to approve John's mortgage. This also required about a month. The woman was lucky. The judge divorced her and Liam at the first meeting, which was held 3 weeks after the application was filed. Almost immediately after that, the bank approved John's mortgage, and he and Lucinda signed a contract of sale of the apartment. There was nothing to keep her here now. After gathering the most necessary things, Lucinda went to the train station. The woman decided that she wanted to start a new life with a clean slate, so she would not take a lot of things with her, because she had enough money to provide herself with everything she needed. Half an hour later, Lucinda stood in front of the ticket booths at the station and chose a direction. She knew for sure that she wouldn't go to a big city, but rather to a place where Liam wouldn't even think of looking for her, to some small, cozy town. Chicago was the choice. The train was leaving in 3 hours. After the choice was made and the tickets were in the woman's hands, Lucinda could relax a little. The woman deposited her suitcase in the luggage room and decided to take a little walk around the city to see it for what she thought would be the last time. There was a small park not far from the train station. Lucinda decided to go there. She bought a cup of ice cream and sat down on a bench. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. The call was from an unknown number. The woman was afraid to answer it at first. 2 disturbing thoughts popped into her head at once. It was someone calling at Liam's request, who had heard about the divorce, or Kevin's father, whose threats Lucinda hadn't forgotten about, even though he hadn't shown himself all this time. Lucinda gingerly pressed the answer button. "Hello," the woman said in a shaky voice. "Hi, it's me. Recognize me?" "Kevin," Lucinda clarified and exhaled with relief. "Yeah, I thought you said I could call you about anything." "Of course you can. I thought you'd call a lot sooner." I'm sorry. I didn't have time. I was raising my dad." The guy laughed. "I'm glad you're in a good mood. How are you?" "I'm finally being discharged from that awful hospital." "That's great news, Kevin. I'm happy for you." "They also said I have a chance at recovery, but I have to fly to Germany for that, so I'm flying out tomorrow." "That's great, Kevin. I told you there was more to come." "Yeah, how's it going with you? Divorced your husband?" "Divorced?" Lucinda sighed. "I sold my apartment and now I'm sitting by the train station waiting for my train." "How far are you going?" "Yeah, not far, Chicago." "Wow. Why did you choose this village to live in?" "Don't be like that, Kevin. It's a nice town, on the Michigan shore, nice and green. I've always wanted to live by the lake, and here, I don't have to be afraid of Liam. I don't think he'd think to look for me there." "Good then. It's always nice when dreams come true. Are you gonna invite me to the housewarming party?" "I will. I just need to buy a place to live, get a job, and do all the things that life in a new place requires." "Well, I can't really go right now either. You know, it's a long way to Germany, and it's gonna take a while to recover, so don't expect it before 6 months." "That's a deal. Good luck, Kevin." "Thanks, Lucinda. You too." After talking to Kevin, the woman felt a little calmer. She believed that the operation would help him get back on his feet and he would be able to live a full life. Lucinda herself had a new life ahead of her, where there would be no more room for people like her husband. Lucinda stepped off the train, the bright summer sun hitting her eyes. The woman looked around. Everything was strange and unfamiliar. While Lucinda was on the road, she thought about how to get settled in her new place. The woman managed to look at several advertisements for apartments. Her money was enough to buy a one-bedroom and still have some money left for living. Lucinda decided to rent a bed in a hostel while she searched for a suitable option. Of course, she could afford a good hotel room, but Lucinda decided that it would be best to save as much money as possible and not spend it on any excesses. There was no telling how the job situation would turn out or how long it would take to find a place to stay. To her surprise, the room was very clean and spacious. There were not many guests, so Lucinda's neighbors were only 2 female students traveling around the city. Lucinda did not dare to deal with the purchase of the apartment herself, so she turned to a real estate agency. She described her wishes and waited for a suitable option. In the end, 3 days later, the realtor called Lucinda and offered several apartments that were for sale almost in the center of the city at a very attractive price. The woman decided to look at each of them. The first apartment was in an old house on the first floor. According to the seller, this apartment was inherited by his grandmother about a year ago. This immediately scared Lucinda away. She did not want to live in an apartment where someone had recently died. The second apartment was in a newer building with a good repair, but even there she felt uncomfortable, though she couldn't explain why. The last option was located on the 8th floor of a 9-story building. It had a beautiful view of the Volga. Lucinda immediately fell in love with this apartment. Despite the fact that it was a little smaller than the previous options, she felt at home in it. Everything was good here. A beautiful view from the window, a convenient layout, modern repairs. Lucinda decided that it was possible to stop at this option. The realtor promised to prepare a sales contract, and the next week Lucinda would be able to move into her new apartment. All this time, Lucinda corresponded with Kevin. He told her about Germany, how nice and beautiful it was. Even from the window of the hospital where he was lying, he had a beautiful view of the architecture of the city. They were preparing him for surgery, collecting all the necessary tests. In turn, Lucinda shared with him her impressions of her new place of residence. She bragged about her future apartment as well. Kevin praised her choice and promised to come and visit her immediately after her return to Russia. The deal to buy the apartment was successful. Gradually, Lucinda bought everything she needed for her new home. Now it was possible to look for a job. The difficulty was that Lucinda had not worked for a long time, so all her previous work experience was not so important to employers. The woman went on interviews, but there were no results. She was either offered too small a salary with irregular working hours or promised to call back, and that was the end of it. After 2 months, she was lucky. A large company from another city was opening a branch in Chicago and was recruiting new employees for the team. Lucinda responded to one of these vacancies, and after an interview, she was offered a good position with a decent salary. So went the usual work routine. Meanwhile, Kevin underwent surgery. It was a success. Now the guy was engaged in recovery procedures. He could already sit freely and try to stand on his feet. There was no talk of full-fledged movement yet, but doctors gave positive forecasts, promising that in 6 months, Kevin would be able to walk without assistance. His father did not spare any money for his son's recovery, and it was paying off. The time flew by very quickly. Lucinda settled into her new place. She liked her new life. The woman had new interesting acquaintances, even began to improve her personal life. One evening after work, she went to her favorite pastry shop. Lucinda wanted to take her favorite cake to celebrate the successful completion of a project at work. But it was the last one, and some man asked him to give up this cake for his favorite daughter, who won a sports competition today and wants this cake as a present. Lucinda couldn't help but give in to the child, and the man, a little embarrassed, asked about Lucinda's plans for the evening. They struck up a conversation. The man's name was Steve. It turned out that he was raising his daughter all alone, his wife having died in a plane crash a few years ago. He ended up inviting Lucinda to join them for a celebration. It was a completely unexpected offer for the woman, but she accepted. She didn't realize how she had agreed so quickly, but there must have been something about this man that was so appealing and special. It was the beginning of their relationship. Steve's daughter also quickly became friends with Lucinda. She was already old enough to realize that Daddy could not live all this life alone with memories of his mother. Therefore, the girl did not interfere with their relationship. It seemed that life got better, and now Lucinda has a calm and bright future ahead of her. But not always in life everything happens exactly as it is desired. Liam was not released until the winter of the following year. The weather outside was gray and snowless. The man shivered. He hadn't been able to get out of prison early, no matter how hard he tried. Kevin's father had done a good job of keeping Liam there for his entire sentence. During the time the man spent incarcerated, many changes took place. The partner he had made a deal with before going to prison turned out to be a corrupt man and canceled all contracts at the first opportunity. And he did it in such a way that Liam was left not just without money, but he was a lot of debts from third-party organizations. In order to cover everything, the man had to sell his house, car, and other property. The money was barely enough. After that, Liam was left literally on the street. All former friends turned away from him because no one wanted to have problems with the law. Liam had nowhere to go. In all his troubles, of course, he blamed Lucinda. After all, in the man's opinion, everything happened because of her. If she hadn't been such a fool then, they'd both be sitting on the ocean somewhere now, enjoying their paradisiacal lives. Liam couldn't accept that, so he decided to visit his ex-wife. He figured she couldn't have traveled far and was now living in her old apartment. Without difficulty remembering the address, the man went there, but he was not opened. A woman shouted through the door that she was not Lucinda and did not live there. Liam knocked for a long time, demanding to be let in, but to no avail. After a while, the police arrived with a man. Together they managed to take Liam to the street, where he told them that his ex-wife lived in the apartment, who had now disappeared and had not given any news about her. Nevertheless, the police had to take the man to the station and make a report on the offense. At the station, Liam once again talked about his problem. He even had the idea of filing a missing persons report for his wife. But he was rebuffed in return, as Lucinda is nobody to him at the moment, and it is quite possible that she deliberately made sure that Liam would not find her. Liam's behavior, given that he was only recently released from prison, did not go unpunished. He was given a 5-day jail sentence. At first, they wanted to give him the full sentence, but they decided that the man was having too much trouble as it was. During the time Liam spent in the cell, he figured out a way to find Lucinda. Since he couldn't find her in a good way, The man decided to file a report that his ex-wife had run away, taking with her a rather serious amount of money from the safe, and the evidence was not his concern. Even if he failed to accuse Lucinda of theft, he would still know where she was, and he could take revenge on her for all his troubles. So Liam did just that. When he was released once again, he first filed a report on the disappearance of a large sum of money and said that no one but his ex-wife could have taken it. The report was accepted and an investigation began. After that, Liam's main problem was the lack of housing. Of course, he had gotten used to inconveniences for the last year and a half, but he could not live on the street in winter or wander around train stations. He had to get a job as a janitor because he could not get any other job with such a past. The pay was pennies, but it was stable. He was also given a small van to live in. Liam was willing to put up with the inconvenience, knowing that the time would come and his ex-wife would be held accountable. In the meantime, the police had begun processing Liam's application. Coincidentally, his case had fallen to the very officer who had once put the man behind bars. Jacob was immediately drawn to the familiar combination of surnames and first names of the defendants, but he couldn't remember them. Too many people he'd had to deal with, and it was impossible to remember each one. Lucinda stood at the airport waiting for her guest. Kevin had called her the night before and told her that he had recently returned from Germany and was eager to meet her. The woman immediately invited him to her house because she had long ago promised to invite him to a housewarming party. The airplane arrived on schedule. Lucinda was very worried. "Wow," Lucinda marveled. "You're walking so well already. I've been working very hard to recover, and it's all thanks to you." "Why thanks to me?" the woman asked in surprise. "Who told me that everything would be all right and life would return to normal?" Kevin laughed. "I'm glad I was able to help you overcome these difficulties. Come on, I'll show you my apartment and then the city." They got into Lucinda's car, which she had recently bought on credit. "Wow," Kevin marveled. "You've already learned to drive." "I have. I have to travel a lot for work, and public transportation is not the most convenient option." "And now how did you manage to get away from work? I mean, it's the middle of the day, right? You won't have any problems because of me." "I took a few days vacation, so I'm completely at your disposal," Lucinda smiled. They reached the apartment. Kevin immediately appreciated the accommodations. She had furnished it very nicely, and there was nothing superfluous. The woman fed her guest lunch, after which they went for a walk around the city. Lucinda took Kevin to her favorite places, told him some stories about the city, which she had learned during her stay in Chicago. After a long walk, the woman suggested her guests to go to a cafe and celebrate their meeting. Kevin gladly agreed. He was tired and hungry during the walk, and he needed an excuse to confess something to Lucinda. As they sat at a table in a cozy cafe, Lucinda told Kevin that she wanted him to meet someone. She had invited Steve and his daughter to this evening so that they could all spend time together. "I thought it would be just the two of us," Kevin said with ill-concealed disappointment. "I think you'll like my friends." Lucinda glanced at the man and the girl who had entered the cafe. As Steve and Nancy approached the table, Lucinda introduced them to each other. "Meet my very good friend, comrade, and just a wonderful guy, Kevin. And this is my future husband, Steve, and his daughter, Xenia." "What husband?" Kevin was outraged. "Lucinda, how could you do this to me?" "Kevin, wait. How could I do this to you? There's too much age difference between you two. You're young, you're hot-blooded, adventurous, and unexplored. And she's got a lot going on in her life. She wants a quiet life. And what makes you think I can't give her that quiet life?" Kevin asked in a calmer voice. "Because I was a young guy in my 20s, I know what it's like. I know what it's like to want to try everything. I even understand your attraction to an older woman, but it'll pass quickly. Trust my experience." "I want to live my experience," Kevin snapped at me. "You shouldn't say that. Lucinda is very nice to you. She's always spoken very warmly of you, but she sees you more as a friend, in some ways even as a son, so she can't share your feelings for her." "What am I supposed to do now? I flew all the way out here to propose, even bought a ring. I wanted to stay here with her. But now I see that I'm not here anymore. Where am I supposed to go?" "Kevin, you need to talk to Lucinda. You two need to work this out together. It'll make you and her feel better. I can't see her. She betrayed me." And you think you're worthy of a grown woman? You sound like a teenager in transition. My advice to you is to find the courage to talk to Lucinda. She's very worried about you. And you know what? If she wants to stay with you after that conversation, I'll back off and stay out of your way. But you have to talk to her yourself. I will. Can you call her? My phone's at the cafe. I don't want to go back there. I'll wait for her at the apartment. I want to talk to her one-on-one. No problem. Do you need a ride? No need. It's not that far, is it? If I remember correctly, it's about a 15-minute walk. Thank you. After this conversation, Kevin went to Lucinda's house and Steve went back to the cafe. On the way, he called Lucinda and relayed the gist of the conversation. The woman replied that she would go home so that Kevin wouldn't arrive before her and wait under the door. Little wonder what might happen to him in a strange town. She offered to take Nancy with her, but Steve said to let his daughter stay at the cafe and wait for him. After all, Lucinda needed to talk to Kevin without strangers. The woman quickly got into her car and was home in 5 minutes. Kevin wasn't there yet. He didn't show up after 10 minutes or 20. Lucinda got worried and started calling Steve to find out what road the guy took and where to look for him. Steve, how did he go? Through town or along the waterfront? I think it was the waterfront. Okay, Lucinda, don't panic. Maybe he just got a little lost. You've given him the address. If he thinks of asking people, it's not too late. They should be able to help him. If he doesn't show up in half an hour, we'll go looking for him. Steve, I can't just sit here and wait. It's winter outside. Then the doorbell rang. Lucinda asked Steve to stay on until she checked to see who was there. The woman looked through the peephole and Kevin was standing outside the door. Steve, he's here, the woman said as she opened the door locks. It's okay. Thank you for your help, thanked Lucinda and passed out. When she finally opened the door, the pungent odor of alcohol hit her nose. Kevin, exclaimed the woman, where have you been? What happened? The guy didn't answer anything. He stepped over the threshold of the house, slammed the door, and passionately kissed Lucinda right on the lips. It seemed like an eternity to Lucinda before Kevin pulled away from her lips. What are you doing? Lucinda was outraged, pushing the boy away from her. I love you. Don't you understand that? I want you all to myself. Lucinda, Lucinda, Lucinda. I'm gonna make you the happiest woman on the planet. I've spent so long planning to meet you, to impress you with how I overcame all the odds, how I learned to walk again. And it's all for you. Why don't you want to give yourself to me? What are you afraid of? I can see that you care about me too. Stop it. Kevin, stop it. You're in no condition to be discussing this right now. Lucinda was shaking with fear, afraid that Kevin might do something stupid that he would regret. Lucinda tried to speak as softly as possible. And tomorrow morning you'll wake up and we'll talk about it. No, I want you to give me an answer right here, right now. Okay, fine. Let's just move to the room and talk about it there anyway. Okay. Kevin reluctantly agreed. That's good. Go sit down and I'll go make us some coffee. You'll be fine. Kevin waved his hand and walked back into the apartment, and Lucinda gave a faint sigh of relief. She still had her cell phone in her hand. Going into the kitchen, the woman quickly typed a message to Steve. Come to my place right away. It didn't take long for a reply. Lucinda quickly ran her eyes over the text. On my way out. I'll be there in 20 minutes. What's wrong? The woman decided not to reply to the message. She busied herself with making coffee. There was no telling what else might cross Kevin's mind. 10 minutes later, Lucinda cautiously exited the kitchen and walked quietly into the room. Kevin was sleeping peacefully, stretched out on the couch. The woman also quietly walked back into the kitchen. Now she could answer Steve quietly. It's okay. I'll tell you when you get here. Just don't ring the bell. After another 10 minutes, there was a gentle knock on the door. It was Steve. He looked worried. Lucinda quietly opened the door and escorted the man into the kitchen, where she told him what had happened. Did he hurt you? The man asked angrily. No, he didn't. It's okay. I told you. He just wanted to tell me how he felt and he kissed me. That's all he did. Lucinda, don't cover for him. I can understand that. I can even accept your friendship. But I don't want you to be miserable because of him. Steve, really? It's okay. Can you stay with me tonight? Yeah, I'll just call Nancy now and let her know. Lucinda set up the cot she prepared especially for Kevin's arrival, and she and Steve went to bed. The man woke up early in the morning when everyone else was still asleep. He carefully got up from his bunk so as not to wake Lucinda and made his way to the bathroom. When he returned to the kitchen, the woman was already preparing breakfast. He gently hugged her from behind and kissed her cheek. "I can't wait for mornings like this to become a regular occurrence," Steve said with a smile. "Me too," Lucinda said, "although I'd rather sleep in a regular bed." They ate breakfast and Steve left for work. "Are you sure you can manage without me?" Steve asked anxiously. "Should I stay up late and wait for Kevin to wake up?" "No, that's okay. He won't hurt me, especially sober. We should talk to him alone after all." "All right, fine. Call me if you need anything." Steve left for work and Lucinda waited for her guest to wake up. Kevin didn't wake up until 11 o'clock. His head hurt terribly and his mouth was all dry. He got up and walked unsteadily to the kitchen, where Lucinda was sitting and thinking about something, staring out the window. "Hi," Kevin said quietly. Lucinda flinched in surprise and looked at him. "Hello," she said sternly. "Lucinda, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have." "Don't, Kevin. I understand perfectly well. Let's just please close the subject once and for all. Sit down. I'll pour you some coffee." Kevin obediently sat down in the chair, and Lucinda continued. "I want to explain to you once again that you are dear to me as a friend. I am worried about you and always have been, probably because I feel guilty about what happened to you. But I never considered you as my life partner. You're very young, and you have your whole life ahead of you. You can finally realize your dream, become a musician, travel the world. But for that, you need another young and ambitious companion. I'm not cut out for that. I'd like you to stay in my life, but if you can't change your attitude towards me, then we better forget about each other once and for all. It's best for everyone." "I hear you," Kevin said after a short pause. "Maybe we really should stop talking for a while. I'll leave tonight, and I won't bother you again. At least not for a while." Kevin drank his coffee, packed his things, and headed for the airport. Lucinda offered him a ride, but he turned out. "I'm sorry for everything. Be happy," said Kevin to Lucinda one last time. They hugged and the guy left her apartment and Lucinda was left alone with her thoughts. She was sorry to break up their peculiar friendship with Kevin, but it was the right thing to do, at least for now. Lucinda had pretty much calmed down by now after the story with Kevin. At first, she had been worried about what had happened, blaming herself for not being able to recognize the guy's feelings for her and for not explaining the impossibility of a love affair between them very clearly. Then Lucinda was angry at Kevin for not wanting to understand the simple truth that, in a woman's opinion, a difference of 14 years between a man and a woman is not acceptable for a happy marriage, especially if the woman is older. And now Lucinda had calmed down. She no longer blamed herself or Kevin. Everything had been resolved more or less well, so it was not worth dwelling on it, Lucinda decided. During this period, the woman often met with Steve, who was always trying to distract her from sad thoughts. This also played a part, and everything seemed to be back to normal, but suddenly there was a new problem. One afternoon, when Lucinda was working on a project, a call from an unknown number popped up on her cell phone. Lucinda didn't see anything suspicious about it. She often received calls from customers and colleagues from other branches, so the woman calmly answered the call. "Lucinda?" The caller clarified. "Yes, it's me. It's Senior Lieutenant Chisholm from Police Station 4. Could you come down here today?" "What's the matter?" Lucinda asked anxiously. "You are a person of interest in a case. We need your testimony." "What case?" "Lucinda, I can't tell you everything over the phone right now. Come down to the station and we'll talk about it." "Okay. Cell phone rings, I'll be there. What time can I do it?" 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock in room 102. "Okay, I'll be there." "Thank you, Lucinda. We'll be waiting for you." Lucinda disconnected the call and began to wonder what this case could be and why the police were suddenly interested in her. The firm's affairs were clean, she was sure of that. She had done nothing illegal. After a while, an unpleasant conjecture visited her thoughts. She thought that it was her ex-husband who decided to challenge his imprisonment and pin all the blame on her. It was not for nothing that he had threatened her then, and according to the time limit, he was about to be released from prison. Lucinda did not say at work that she was summoned to the police. She just pretended that, as usual, she went on company business. On the way to the police station, she called Steve and told him about today's call and her suspicions. The man asked her to keep him informed about everything that was going on and, most importantly, not to panic early. The woman easily found the right office and knocked on the door. "Come in," she heard from behind the door. "Hello, I got a call today asking me to come in on a case." "Lucinda?" said the owner of the office. "Yes," Lucinda answered briefly. "Please have a seat. I'm the one who called you. My name is Tony." Lucinda carefully sat down on the chair opposite the policeman and looked at him with a questioning look. "Tell me, please, how long have you lived in Chicago?" The officer began his interrogation. "About 2 years. Wait a minute. Maybe I should get a lawyer. I don't want any trouble, and I don't want you to accuse me of anything when I can't defend myself." Lucinda chose a defensive position. "Lucinda, you can certainly have a lawyer, but I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just getting some details." Lucinda did not answer anything. She silently looked at her interlocutor. "Can we continue?" he clarified. "Yes, but if I don't like something, I can refuse to answer your questions." "Of course you can, but I strongly advise you to tell me the truth. It's in your own interest." "All right, I understand. Let's continue. Where do you live?" "In my apartment, which I bought when I got to Chicago." "And how did you buy the apartment?" "I sold my apartment in another city and used the money to buy a place here." "Can you document that?" "Of course. My documents are in order, but I don't carry them with me, so I keep them at home." "And your car was purchased with what funds?" "It was bought on credit. I have the paperwork to prove it too, and I have it at home." "Lucinda, please don't take this personally. I'm not going to accuse you of anything. I'm just trying to get the whole picture. Then maybe you can tell me what's going on and what happened. Tell me, do you know Liam?" Lucinda flinched at the name of her ex-husband. She knew it was him, but she didn't know what he was up to yet. "It's my ex-husband," Lucinda replied in a trembling voice. "The thing is, a few days ago, we received a request from your hometown. Liam claims that a large sum of money has gone missing from his safe, and he named you as the only suspect since no one else was in his house during his absence." "But that's nonsense," Lucinda said indignantly. "I ran away from this house as soon as he was put in jail. I hardly even took my things." "Lucinda, please calm down. We're gonna figure this out. You're not facing any charges yet. To be honest, he couldn't provide any evidence that anyone else was in the house or that the money was stolen at all. It's all in his own words, but we're obliged to check it out. Thank you for your cooperation. Please stay in touch. I don't want to restrict your freedom in any way, so I just ask you not to leave the city, especially if you are not involved. You have nothing to fear." After that, Tony said goodbye to Lucinda, and the woman left the station. She felt very bad. Liam was sitting in Jacob's office, who had called him in for more information after the results of his conversation with Lucinda had come back from Chicago. Liam had a nasty smile on his face. He felt that his plan had worked and the police had found Lucinda. Now it was just a matter of finding her. We needed to get his ex-wife's phone number, or better yet, her address. "We've spoken to your wife, Liam, and she claims she had nothing to do with your money, and we have no reason not to trust her." "Of course she has nothing to do with it," Liam replied mockingly. "Did you think she'd just confess to you right away? I stole all the money from my husband, and now I'm living on my own while he's rotting away in his shitty job." "Liam, I'm going to have to ask you to watch your language. Why don't we have a straight talk? I wonder what it's about. You never forgave your wife for not covering for you in the accident case, and now you want her to suffer too. Isn't that right?" Jacob spent a long time trying to remember why this man looked so familiar. He checked the database, pulled up old cases, and it all came back to him. This was the man who caused a drunken accident, almost taking a young man's life, and then wanted to frame his wife. What a load of crap. Liam was outraged. "I need her. I just need her to give me back what she stole from me." "You see, Liam, the thing is," Jacob began to speak in a very quiet voice, "you couldn't give us any proof that you had the money at all, and even less that your ex-wife could be involved in this case. Come on, there was no theft, was there? Can I at least see the answers to the questions about my money?" Liam asked irritably. No, I can't give you that information. It is confidential and has no value to you. How dare you? Liam said with feigned emotion and immediately clutched his heart. Can I at least ask you for some water? He added quietly, mimicking a painful grimace. Liam realized that he was acting like a pussycat in a cheap soap opera, but he was still acting. Jacob grudgingly got up from his seat and walked out into the hallway to the water cooler. Even though the distance from the office to the water cooler wasn't very far, it was enough time for Liam to find the information he needed in his file on the desk. Among the other papers was a sheet of Lucinda's data. He quickly snapped a picture of them on his cell phone and slammed the folder shut, putting it back where it belonged. Jacob returned at the same second. Here you go. The man held out a glass of water. Thank you, Liam said, and drank the water in one gulp. You know, you're right. I was just trying to get back at my wife for my broken fate. You're the one who broke it. You don't have to continue your investigation. I don't care. Let him go to hell with the money. Jacob wanted to say something, but Liam had already left his office. The man walked outside and headed for his gatehouse with a triumphant look on his face. I told you couldn't hide from me, Liam muttered under his breath. Wait for me to visit, sweetheart. I'll see you soon. After that, the man packed his modest belongings, took out the money he'd saved lately, and headed for the airport. He didn't plan to go back. There was nothing to keep him in this city anymore. He wanted to get to his ex-wife as soon as possible. So he wasn't going to waste time on the train, especially since the ticket price for these modes of transportation didn't differ much. Liam bought a ticket for the nearest flight, and in 3 hours he was already sitting on the plane, anticipating his meeting with Lucinda. It was a cold February evening outside. Lucinda was at home and was going to meet Steve. He had invited her to the theater for the opening night of a play. The man was supposed to pick Lucinda up in half an hour. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. You're early, Lucinda said, opening the door, but when she saw Liam on the threshold, she was startled. You? Were you expecting someone else, my dear? Liam pushed Lucinda roughly into the apartment, then walked in and slammed the door behind him. What are you doing here? Lucinda asked breathlessly. What's up? Liam grinned. I came to see my favorite wife. I see you're greeting me in full dress. How did you find me? Well, I told you I'd do it no matter how you hid, and I'm never one to throw words around. What do you want from me now? You took everything away from me. After I got out of prison, I had to sell everything to pay off the debts my last partner left me in the graveyard of my business. After that, I had to live in a stinking gatehouse and sweep the damn yards every morning, all just to find you. I wanted to file a missing persons report on you at first, but they turned me down. So I figured out a way to get those stupid cops to come after you. Then it was just a matter of doing the little things. Although I had to use my acting talent, the stubborn policeman didn't want to give me your details. But now, as you can see, I'm here with you. Liam, what do you want? We're not husband and wife for a long time. Lucinda tried to speak as calmly as possible. The woman was stalling for time because Steve should be here any minute. Lucinda hoped that he would be able to fix the problem. It's okay, we'll get remarried. You've left me with nowhere else to live and no one will hire me, so I'm staying here on your full support. I've fed you, clothed you, taken you to resorts. Now it's your turn. What are you talking about? I have a fiancé and he'll be here soon. Oh, you scared me, Liam said with a sneer. If he tries to come in here, I'll break every bone in his body. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Lucinda wanted to go to the door and open it, but Liam wouldn't let her. Don't you dare. I'm tired right now and I don't want to talk to anyone. Let her go. But the doorbell kept ringing. At the same time, Lucinda's cell phone rang. Answer it and tell her you're not going anywhere. And if you fart, I'll kill you where you stand. I've got nothing to lose. Do you understand? Lucinda nodded and hit the answer button. Steve, I'm sorry. I'm not feeling very well. I got a headache and I fell asleep. Look, can we postpone our trip to the theater? I'm really not feeling very well right now. Lucinda, I've been standing on your doorstep for about 10 minutes. Why don't you let me in? Steve, I'm sorry. I look terrible and I don't want you to see me like this. Why don't we meet tomorrow? Is there anything you need? Medication? No, thanks. I love you. Love you too. I'll call you tomorrow morning. Steve disconnected the call and went to the elevator. Liam watched through the peephole. Good for you. You did the right thing. Now let's go to the kitchen. I'm hungry. Lucinda obediently led her ex-husband to the table and began to warm his dinner. Liam smugly watched the woman. After a while, she put a plate of pasta and a glass of tomato juice in front of him. Don't you have anything to drink? No, Lucinda answered briefly. That's too bad. All right, sit down and eat too. I'm sick of eating alone. I don't want to, the woman tried to object. Eat, I said, Liam shouted and pounded his fist on the table. Lucinda flinched in surprise and obediently placed the same plate in front of her. After dinner, Liam said he wanted to go to bed. Lucinda tried to linger in the kitchen to do the dishes, but the man wouldn't let her do so and told her to go with him to his room. Lucinda made the bed and Liam unceremoniously laid down on it. Lie down, he commanded Lucinda. Could I at least take a shower? She asked timidly. That's the last thing I need. You're going to run away from me, and I'm too tired to keep you there. But after a short pause, Liam added, Go, though. Only take your clothes off here. Why? Lucinda asked in horror. I want to see if you've gained any fat. Liam laughed. I want a slim wife. What are you talking about? Lucinda's eyes started to water. Don't cry, you idiot. It's like nothing ever happened between us. You know, I haven't even cheated on you once in all these years. You're the last one I had sex with. So you can imagine how hungry I am for a woman's warmth. Lucinda was already sobbing at the top of her voice. She was scared and disgusted at the same time. And most importantly, she didn't know how to find a way out of this situation. Shut up. Liam jumped up to Lucinda and slapped her painfully on the cheek. The woman immediately shut up and looked at him with eyes full of hatred. Get undressed, Liam repeated his order in a commanding voice. Lucinda began to slowly remove her clothes, and Liam just watched this spectacle from the side. After 5 minutes, Lucinda was standing in front of him completely naked. The man slowly approached her, ran his hands over her breasts and thighs. Then he kissed her greedily. Please, can I take a shower? Lucinda moaned pitifully. You have 3 minutes, Liam shouted, and don't do anything stupid. The man went back to bed, and Lucinda ran to the bathroom, quietly opening the locks on the front door on the way. She herself didn't know how that would help her in this situation, but the woman hoped for a miracle. Lucinda stepped into the bathroom and closed the door on the latch. Time was not on her side. What to do now and how to get out of this situation, she had no idea. Words couldn't get through to Liam, at least not now. He hadn't wanted to listen to Lucinda before, even when they were still married, and now that the man thought she was to blame for all his problems, he wouldn't talk to her. Needing to run was the only way out. Quickly wrapping a towel around herself, Lucinda cautiously opened the door. It was dark and Liam was nowhere to be seen. The woman tiptoed through the door and headed for the exit. Suddenly, she heard her ex-husband's mocking voice. Are you going far? Lucinda was stunned with horror. She realized that this was the end. She would not have a chance to escape again. Liam, listen, Lucinda began to say, trying to appeal to her ex-husband's reason. Don't do this, I beg you. This isn't who you are. Maybe I wasn't before you put me in jail, but I am now. Liam, it's not my fault you're in prison. You caused that accident. You drove drunk. I just told the police what happened. I didn't want to hurt you. Of course you didn't. If you hadn't, you wouldn't have run away like a rat. I asked you for help. I had a lot of money and I could really get out of jail. But you wouldn't do it. You chose to run away from me and leave me alone with all this shit. You made your own choices, and now you're gonna have to pay me back. I've given you everything for years. Now you're gonna give it to me for a dime. Now enough words. Let's get back to business. Liam pulled the towel off Lucinda with a sharp movement. She tried to run, but the man grabbed her arm and squeezed her wrist painfully. You're not going anywhere. Calm down, or it will only get worse. He dragged Lucinda into the room and pushed her onto the bed, then piled his body on top of her. No, don't. Please let go. Lucinda screamed, but it only made Liam stronger. The man reveled in his newfound power over his ex-wife. He could see how scared she was and he loved it. Scream, It only turns me on. Lucinda had lost all hope and was running out of strength. She could no longer resist her ex-husband. The woman closed her eyes, resigned to her fate. Suddenly there was a thud, and Liam collapsed on top of Lucinda. It was hard to breathe for a few seconds, but someone moved her ex-husband off her and gently ran his hand over her cheek. "Lucinda, it's all right." Lucinda heard Steve's voice. Steve, how? How did you get in here? We have to call the police right now." "Lucinda, calm down. I've already done it. You get dressed, and I'll disarm this guy before he comes to his senses." Lucinda quickly jumped out of bed and threw on the first robe she could find. 5 minutes later, the police arrived. They made a report of what had happened and took Liam to the station. Lucinda was still reeling from the nightmare she had been through. She and Steve were sitting in the kitchen, and he placed a glass of alcohol in front of Lucinda. "Drink this, it will help you calm down and relax." Lucinda obediently did so. The tension really began to subside, and she was able to regain some of her composure. "Steve, how did you know I needed help?" Lucinda asked. "I don't know. I felt it. At first I thought you were really sick and fast asleep, so you didn't hear my calls. I got out of the driveway, got in my car, and drove home. But something kept bugging me. I mean, in all the time I've known you, you've never done that. You've had health problems, but you've always been happy to see me. And now you wouldn't even open the door, even though we talked this afternoon and everything was fine. And then I remembered your story about being called to the police on some case involving your ex-husband. I put two and two together, and I had an unpleasant hunch. I didn't want to believe that anything bad could happen to you, but I decided to see if it was true, so I quickly got into my car and drove back to your place. I was about to press the bell, but suddenly I heard you screaming from behind the door. I quickly called the police, thinking about how I could stall until they arrived. Then I jerked the doorknob, and by some miracle it opened. I grabbed the first thing that came to hand and ran toward the sounds. And then you know the rest." Lucinda was again struck by a wave of horror at the realization of what could have happened to her and how Steve had miraculously been there at the very last moment. The man came close to her, hugged her tightly, yet gently, and said softly, "I'll never leave you alone now. Too many things happened to you when I wasn't around. Perhaps now is not the right time, but still, Lucinda, do you want to be my wife?" Lucinda looked up at Steve with eyes full of tears. She had really gone through too much turmoil lately with her past life. Now she wanted a simple woman's happiness. "I do," Lucinda whispered back. The very next day, Steve took Lucinda to his house. There was no telling who else would want to infringe on her in light of recent events. A short time later, they were married. It was a simple wedding without any frills. The newlyweds did not organize a celebration, just a quiet dinner with their family. Now it seemed to Lucinda that here it was, a real happy family life, and for this it was not necessary to have golden mountains. As for Liam, he was being prosecuted for attempted rape. There was plenty of evidence, plus the testimony of Steve and neighbors who heard the screams, as well as characteristic marks on Lucinda's body. However, after a forensic psychiatric examination, it was found that the man had certain deviations. According to the court decision, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for compulsory treatment, where he is likely to remain, if not for life, then for a very long period of time.